The rain was still dripping from my hair when I walked into that bank. 24 hours earlier, I had a home, a family, a place at the dinner table. Now I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a worn leather wallet my grandfather gave me before he died. My father's words still echoed in my head, "Get out. You're not my daughter anymore." All because I refused to apologize to my stepmother for something I didn't do. She smiled as I walked out into the storm. My brother laughed, and my own father, slammed the door behind me. I was 36 years old, homeless, and completely alone. But here's what none of them knew. Inside that old wallet was a card I'd never seen before. Strange symbols. No bank name. Just a number etched into metal that felt heavier than any credit card should. I almost threw it away. What could a dead man's card possibly be worth? But something made me walk into that bank. Something made me hand it to the teller. And the moment she scanned it, her face went white. She didn't speak. She just pressed a button under her desk and security guards started walking toward me. I thought I was being arrested. I was wrong. What happened next changed everything I believed about my grandfather, my family, and the inheritance they never wanted me to find. This is the story of how I went from being thrown away like garbage to discovering a fortune they tried to hide, and how I made every single one of them pay. Stay with me until the end. Because what my family did to me, they're about to regret it for the rest of their lives. My name is Marissa Kelly. I'm 36 years old, and until yesterday I worked as an administrative assistant at a small insurance company in our town. Nothing glamorous, nothing impressive. Just a quiet life in the shadow of a family that never wanted me to succeed. This is the story of the night that changed everything. To my family, I was still the disappointing daughter, the one who never quite measured up, the one they'd rather forget existed. I stood on my parents' porch that Christmas Eve holding a card I'd made by hand. Not bought from a store, not ordered online made. I'd sat at my kitchen table the night before with cardstock and colored pencils, carefully writing words I'd rehearsed 100 times. Words about wanting to try again. Words about hoping this year could be different. The envelope was slightly crooked because my hands had been shaking when I sealed it. The wreath on their door was new, thick with artificial pine and red velvet ribbon. Through the frosted window, I could see the tree glowing in the living room ornaments catching the light. For just a moment, I let myself remember Christmas when I was small before everything went wrong, back when I still believed my parents loved both their daughters equally. Before I understood that some children are golden and some are invisible. I rang the doorbell. My father answered. He was wearing the cashmere sweater I knew my sister had bought him, probably with money she'd asked him to loan her. His expression when he saw me wasn't cold exactly. It was worse than cold. It was inconvenienced. "Brianna." Not a greeting, just an identification, like naming an unexpected package left on the doorstep. "Merry Christmas, Dad." I held out the card. "I made this for you and Mom. I was hoping we could talk. It's been so long since we really—" He took the card from my hand, and for one flickering second, I felt hope. He was going to read it. He was going to see how hard I was trying. He opened it. His eyes moved across my careful handwriting, the message about missing them, about wanting to rebuild what we'd lost, about believing it wasn't too late for us to be a real family again. I watched his face for any sign of softening. "You think you're better than everyone at this table, don't you?" "Daniel," Pastor Williams began, "perhaps this isn't the time." "No, Pastor, this is exactly the time." My father stood up, and I watched the transformation I had witnessed countless times before. The respectable businessman, the church elder, the pillar of the community becoming something else entirely. "My daughter needs to understand that her behavior has consequences." I gripped the edge of my chair. Memories flooded through me, unbidden years of moments just like this one. The time I won the spelling bee in 6th grade, and my father said it was just luck. The time I graduated with honors, and he spent the entire dinner talking about Derek's baseball game. The time I got promoted at work and no one in my family even acknowledged it. I looked across the table at Derek, who was wearing grandfather's ring. But this was the game we played, the polite fiction that my exclusion was accidental rather than intentional. My sister emerged from the living room in a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Lauren had always been the beautiful one, the successful one, the daughter my parents actually wanted. She was 2 years younger than me, but had somehow always been treated as the elder, wiser, more worthy, more deserving of attention and resources and love. Well, well, Lauren looked me up and down, taking in my simple sweater and wool skirt. Look who decided to grace us with her presence. Did you take the bus, or can you afford gas these days? I didn't answer. I'd learned long ago that engaging only made it worse. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Every topic somehow curved back toward my failures. My little apartment in that sketchy neighborhood. My job that Lauren dismissed as pushing papers for people who actually make money. My unmarried status, my modest car, my thrift store coat hanging in the hallway. Meanwhile, Lauren held court. Her promotion, her vacation plans. The important people she knew, the parties she attended, the life she was living that sparkled so much brighter than mine. My mother nodded along to everything Lauren said, her face glowing with pride. My father asked Lauren questions, engaged with her stories, laughed at her jokes. When I tried to mention a project I'd been working on, something I was actually proud of, the table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds before my father turned back to Lauren and asked about her tennis game. I looked down at my plate. The food was beautifully prepared, but I couldn't taste any of it. On my finger, my grandmother's ring caught the candlelight. She'd left it to me when she died, the only person in my family who ever seemed to see me clearly. "You have a fire in you," she used to say, her papery hand squeezing mine. "Don't let them put it out." I walked to the door without another word. There was nothing left to say. Perhaps there never had been. The rain hit my face like 1,000 tiny accusations as I stepped outside. I picked up my suitcase from the muddy lawn and began walking. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was going to do. I only knew that the life I had been barely holding together had finally fallen apart completely. I walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes before I found shelter under the awning of a closed hardware store. My clothes were soaked through and I was shivering so badly that I could barely open my purse to check if I had enough money for a motel room. That's when I noticed it. In the wallet my grandfather had given me years ago, tucked into a pocket I never used, was a card I had never seen before. It was metal, not plastic, with strange symbols embossed on its surface. No bank name, no account number visible, just a pattern that seemed almost like a code. And suddenly, I remembered. 3 weeks before he died, Grandfather had pressed this wallet into my hands. His eyes had been intense, urgent, as he whispered words I hadn't understood at the time. "Keep this safe, Marissa, and whatever you do, never let your father know about it." I stared at the card in my trembling hands, rain dripping from my hair onto its metallic surface. What had my grandfather been hiding? I stood under that hardware store awning for nearly an hour, turning the card over and over in my hands. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and neither did the questions racing through my mind. The metal was heavier than any credit card I had ever held, with a weight that seemed almost deliberate, as if whoever made it wanted the holder to understand that this was something significant. The symbols embossed on its surface caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. Strange geometric patterns that looked more like ancient codes than modern banking logos. I traced my finger along the edges, trying to remember everything about the moment Grandfather had given me this wallet. It was 3 weeks before his heart finally gave out during one of my visits to his small apartment on the other side of town. He had been sitting in his worn leather chair, the one that smelled like pipe tobacco and old books, and he had called me over with an urgency that seemed out of place for such a simple gift. "This wallet belonged to your grandmother," he had said, pressing it into my hands. "I want you to have it now. Keep it safe, Marissa. And one day, when everything becomes dark, open it. Really open it. look in every pocket. I had thanked him and tucked it into my purse, assuming it was just the sentimental gesture of an old man who knew his time was running short. Grandfather had always been poetic in his way of speaking, full of metaphors and hidden meanings that I rarely understood. I thought, when everything becomes dark, was just his way of saying I might need comfort someday when I missed him. I never imagined he meant it literally. Now, standing homeless in a rainstorm after being thrown out by my own father, I understood. Grandfather had known. Somehow impossibly, he had known this moment would come. He had prepared for it. He had prepared me for it in his quiet, mysterious way. The memories began flooding back, fragments of grandfather's life that I had witnessed but never questioned. Every Sunday morning without fail, he would walk to the corner store and buy 3 different financial newspapers. Not the local Gazette or the sports section like other men his age. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Barron's. He would spend hours poring over them, making notes in a small leather journal that he kept locked in his desk drawer. I remembered asking him once why he cared so much about stocks and bonds when he lived in such a modest apartment. He had smiled that enigmatic smile of his and said, "Knowledge is its own reward, Marissa, and sometimes knowing what something is worth is more important than having it." I had not understood then. I was beginning to understand now. There were the trips to Vermont, too. Every few months, Grandfather would disappear for 3 or 4 days, telling everyone he was visiting an old army buddy. But he always came back with soil under his fingernails and a faraway look in his eyes, as if he had been tending to something important, something private. When I asked about these trips once, he had simply said, "Some things are worth protecting even from family, especially from family." Most vivid in my memory was his absolute insistence that Victoria, my stepmother, was never allowed near his filing cabinet. He kept it locked with a key he wore around his neck, and during family gatherings at his apartment, he would watch her like a hawk whenever she wandered too close to his study. I had always assumed it was just the paranoia of an old man, perhaps some tension between them that I was not privy to. Now I wondered if there was something in those files that Victoria wanted, something Grandfather was determined to keep from her. And then there was the story about Grandmother. I had only heard it once when I was sitting with Grandfather on his porch during a summer evening. He had been in a reflective mood, staring at the sunset with tears glistening in his eyes. "Your grandmother was the strongest woman I ever knew," he had said. "When she got sick, when the cancer came, I wanted to give up. But she made me promise to fight. She knew what had caused it, you see. A company that poisoned the water. Chemicals they dumped because it was cheaper than disposing of them properly. She made me promise to make them pay." He had paused, then his jaw tightening with an old anger. "It took me 10 years, Marissa, 10 years of fighting, but I kept my promise to her, and one day I will tell you everything. When you are ready, when you need to know." He never got the chance. His heart attack came suddenly, stealing him away before he could explain what that fight had meant, what he had won or lost, what any of it had to do with the strange card now clutched in my trembling hands. The rain began to lighten as midnight approached. I found a 24-hour diner a few blocks away and spent the night nursing cups of coffee, watching the steam rise and dissolve into nothing. I did not sleep. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face twisted with rage, Derek's mocking laughter, Victoria's satisfied smile. And underneath all of that, I saw Grandfather's eyes, urgent and knowing, pressing the wallet into my hands. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I would go to a bank. Any bank. I would present this strange card and see what happened. It was almost certainly a waste of time. The card was probably expired or connected to an account that had been closed when Grandfather died, or simply worthless altogether. But I had nothing left. No home, no family, no future that I could see. What was the harm in one more disappointment? I found a branch of First National Trust 3 blocks from the diner. It was a solid, respectable-looking building with marble columns and brass fixtures, the kind of bank that catered to wealthy clients and old money. I felt out of place the moment I walked through the doors, still wearing yesterday's clothes, my hair tangled and my eyes red from exhaustion and tears. The teller was a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a professional smile that faltered slightly when she saw my disheveled appearance. But she maintained her composure and asked how she could help me. "I found this card," I said, sliding it across the counter. "It belonged to my grandfather. I am not even sure what it is, but I was hoping you could tell me if it is connected to an account here." She picked up the card and I watched her expression shift from polite patience to confusion to something else entirely. Her face went pale. Her hands began to tremble slightly. She looked at the card, then at me, then back at the card again. Without a word, she pressed a button under her counter. Within seconds, 2 security guards appeared at either side of me. "Ma'am," the teller said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please do not move. The manager will be with you shortly." My heart stopped. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet seemed frozen to the marble floor. This was it. I had done something wrong. The card was stolen or connected to some kind of fraud, and now I was going to be arrested. I would spend what little money I had on bail, assuming I could even make bail, and my father would hear about it and use it as proof that I was exactly the worthless disappointment he had always claimed I was. The security guards positioned themselves on either side of me, but they did not reach for handcuffs. They did not grab my arms or read me my rights. Instead, one of them gestured politely toward a hallway behind the teller windows. "Ma'am, if you would please come with us," he said. His voice was respectful, almost deferential. "For your protection." For my protection. The words made no sense. I was a disheveled woman in yesterday's clothes presenting a mysterious card at a bank where I had never held an account. What could I possibly need protection from? I followed them because I did not know what else to do. They led me through a door marked "Private" and down a carpeted hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-looking men in suits. At the end of the hall was a conference room with leather chairs, a mahogany table, and windows that overlooked the city below. One of the guards pulled out a chair for me and asked if I would like water or coffee. I shook my head, too stunned to speak. We waited in silence for nearly 10 minutes. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, trying to calm my racing thoughts, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming. The guard stood by the door, not menacing, but alert, as if they were watching for threats from outside rather than preventing me from leaving. When the door finally opened, a man in his 50s entered. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and his silver hair was combed back with meticulous precision. But despite his polished appearance, I could see that he was nervous. There was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, and his hands trembled slightly as he closed the door behind him. "Miss Kelly," he said, extending his hand. "I am Robert Ashworth, senior manager of this branch. I apologize for the unusual circumstances of this meeting. Please understand that the protocols we activated are not meant to alarm you. They are meant to protect you." I shook his hand, still not trusting my voice. He sat down across from me and placed the metal card on the table between us. "May I ask where you obtained this?" "It was my grandfather's," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He gave me a wallet before he died. I found the card inside last night." Mr. Ashworth nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "Miss Kelly, this card triggered the highest security protocol in our entire system. It is not a standard account card. It is not even a premium account card. This is what we call a legacy trust indicator, and there are only 12 like it in the entire United States." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "I do not understand. My grandfather lived in a small apartment. He wore the same cardigan for 15 years. He was not wealthy." "With respect, Miss Kelly, that is precisely what he wanted everyone to believe." Mr. Ashworth opened a leather folder he had brought with him and spread several documents across the table. "This account has been flagged "Do Not Disclose" for over 15 years. That means no employee of this bank, regardless of their rank or clearance level, has been permitted to access its contents. The only way to unlock this account is for the legitimate heir to present the physical card in person along with verified identification." "The legitimate heir," I repeated. "You mean me?" "I mean whoever your grandfather designated in the trust documents." We could not know who that was until you presented the card. The system is designed this way specifically to prevent unauthorized access." He paused, his expression growing darker. "And there have been unauthorized access attempts, Miss Kelly. 3 of them in the past year alone." Something cold settled in my stomach. "Who?" Mr. Ashworth turned one of the documents toward me. It was a security log, a printout of dates and times and names. 3 entries were highlighted in yellow, each one showing the same name in the requesting party column. Daniel Kelly. My father. I read the name 3 times as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. My father had tried to access this account, not once, but 3 times. He had come to this very bank, probably sat in this very room, and demanded to see what was inside. And the bank had refused him. "He was denied each time," Mr. Ashworth said quietly. "The trust was very specific. Only the designated heir could access the account, and only with the physical card. Your father claimed he did not know where the card was. He insisted he was entitled to the contents as next of kin, but the trust documents were clear. He was explicitly excluded." My grandfather had excluded my father, deliberately, specifically. He had set up an account worth triggering the highest security protocols in a major bank, and he had made absolutely certain that his own son could never touch it. "I need to verify your identity," Mr. Ashworth said. "This will take a few minutes. We will need your driver's license, your social security number, and we will need to ask you some questions that only the legitimate heir would know the answers to. Your grandfather set these questions himself 15 years ago." The verification process took nearly an hour. I answered questions about my grandmother's maiden name, about the street where my grandfather grew up, about the name of the dog he had as a child. I answered questions I did not even remember knowing the answers to information that must have seeped into my memory during all those long afternoons I spent with him, while the rest of my family pretended I did not exist. When it was over, Mr. Ashworth sat back in his chair with an expression of visible relief. "Miss Kelly, you are confirmed as the designated successor to this trust. You are the only person legally entitled to access its contents." He typed something into a laptop, then turned the screen toward me. His hands were shaking again. "Before I show you this," he said, "I need you to understand something. What you are about to see is not meant for anyone else to know. Your grandfather was very specific about that. He did not want his family, his friends, or anyone in his community to know what he had accomplished. He lived modestly by choice, not by necessity." I gripped the arms of my chair, bracing myself for something I could not even imagine. Mr. Ashworth met my eyes, and in his gaze I saw something that looked almost like awe. "Miss Kelly," he said quietly, "do you know who your grandfather really was?" I shook my head slowly, the question hanging in the air between us like something fragile that might shatter if I answered wrong. Who was my grandfather really? He was a quiet man who lived alone after my grandmother died. He was someone who wore the same clothes year after year, who clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, who once told me he could not afford to replace his broken television, so he simply stopped watching it. He was the only person in my family who ever made me feel like I was worth something, but he was not wealthy. He could not have been wealthy. I would have known. Mr. Ashworth turned the laptop screen fully toward me, and everything I thought I knew about my grandfather, about my family, about my entire life crumbled into dust. The screen displayed an account summary with multiple sections, each one representing a different type of asset. The first section showed equity holding stocks in technology companies with names I recognized from news headlines purchased in the 1980s, when they were still struggling startups operating out of garages. The value of these holdings alone was over $14 million. The second section showed government bonds, conservative investments that had been steadily accumulating interest for 3 decades, worth another $8 million. The third section listed real estate holdings, including a property in Vermont, that I suddenly realized must have been where grandfather disappeared to on those mysterious trips. The property was valued at $2.3 million. And finally, there was a gold reserve account, physical gold stored in a secure facility worth nearly $5 million. I stared at the total figure at the bottom of the screen. My vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt sideways, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep myself from sliding out of my chair. $29,462,000. My grandfather, the man who darned his own socks and ate oatmeal for breakfast every single day because it was the cheapest option, had been worth nearly $30 million. "This cannot be real," I whispered. "There has to be a mistake." "There is no mistake, Miss Kelly." Mr. Ashworth's voice was gentle, as if he understood the shock I was experiencing. "Your grandfather was one of the most careful, deliberate investors I have ever encountered. He built this portfolio over 30 years with patience and precision. Every purchase was strategic. Every decision was calculated. And he did it all while living a life that gave no indication of his true wealth." "But why?" The question came out as almost a sob. Why would he live like that? Why would he let everyone think he had nothing? "Mr." Ashworth leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. "Your grandfather left instructions for this moment. He anticipated that you would have questions, and he wanted me to provide answers. May I?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. 30 years ago, your grandmother Eleanor was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Your grandfather believed her illness was caused by industrial chemicals that had been dumped into the local water supply by a major manufacturing corporation. He spent 2 years gathering evidence documenting the contamination, interviewing other families who had been affected. And then he filed a lawsuit. The story grandfather had told me on the porch that summer evening. The fight that lasted 10 years. The promise he made to my grandmother. "It took nearly a decade," Mr. Ashworth continued, "but your grandfather won. It was one of the first successful environmental justice cases in American history. The settlement was substantial enough to have lived very comfortably for the rest of his life. But your grandfather had a different plan. He hid it." I said, the pieces finally beginning to fall into place. "He hid all of it. He invested it. Quietly, carefully. He told no one except the attorneys who managed the trust and the bankers who handled the accounts. And he watched." "Watched what?" Mr. Ashworth met my eyes with a look that was almost sad. "He watched his family, Miss Kelly. He wanted to see what kind of people they really were. He believed that money reveals character, that the prospect of inheritance either brings out the best in people or the worst. So he waited. He observed. And he made his decisions based on what he saw. The trust conditions suddenly made terrible, perfect sense. The account could only be activated when I arrived in person with the original card at least 1 year after grandfather's death. He had designed it as a test. If my family had loved me, if they had treated me with even basic dignity and respect, they would have given me the wallet, helped me discover the card, supported me in claiming what was rightfully mine. If I had to find it on my own, hidden in a pocket, I never thought to check it, meant they had failed the test. They had abandoned me just as grandfather predicted they would. "He knew," I said, my voice hollow. "He knew they would throw me out." "He suspected. He hoped he was wrong. But he prepared for the possibility that he was right." Mr. Ashworth turned to another page in his folder. "Your grandfather explicitly excluded your father from this trust. The language is very specific. Daniel Kelly is named directly as someone who is not entitled to any portion of these assets under any circumstances. The same exclusion applies to anyone your father might designate as a proxy or representative. My stepmother, my brother, anyone. Your grandfather was very thorough." He paused, his expression darkening. "And given the access attempts we have logged, his caution appears to have been justified." He turned the laptop screen to show me another page, a security log that I had glimpsed earlier but not fully processed. 3 entries glowed on the screen, each one marked with a red warning flag. The dates spanned the past year, starting just 2 months after grandfather's funeral. And each entry showed the same name in the requester field, Daniel Kelly. I read through the notes attached to each attempt. The first time my father had arrived at this very branch, demanding access to his father's accounts. He had presented himself as next of kin, as the obvious heir, as someone entitled to know what his father had left behind. When the bank refused to disclose any information without the designated heir present, he had threatened legal action. The second attempt came 3 months later. This time my father had brought a lawyer. They had argued that the trust conditions were unreasonable, that no legitimate financial institution would lock out a man's own son from his inheritance. The bank had held firm, citing the explicit exclusion in the trust documents. The third attempt was only 6 weeks ago. My father had returned alone, calmer this time, almost desperate. According to the notes, he had asked if there was any way, any possible exception, any scenario in which he might be granted access to even partial information about the trust. The bank had refused again. 3 attempts. 3 failures. And then, just days later, my father had thrown me out of his house with nothing. He had known about this money all along. He had been trying to steal it for himself. And when he finally realized he could never get it, he had decided to destroy the one person who could. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My father had not thrown me out because of a disagreement at dinner. He had not cast me aside because I refused to apologize to Victoria. He had done it because he knew about this fortune, had been trying to claim it for over a year, and had finally understood that he would never get his hands on it as long as I existed. The dinner confrontation was not a spontaneous explosion of anger. It was a calculated move, a final attempt to remove me from the equation entirely. Mr. Ashworth seemed to sense the storm of emotions raging inside me. He waited quietly, giving me time to process what I had learned before speaking again. "There is more," he said gently. "Your grandfather left additional documents in the restricted files. One of them is a letter addressed specifically to you. He wrote it 5 years ago and updated it annually until his death. The most recent version is dated just 6 weeks before he passed." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name was written on the front in grandfather's careful, old-fashioned handwriting. "I will give you privacy to read this. Take as much time as you need." He stood and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "Miss Kelly, whatever you decide to do with this inheritance, please know that your grandfather spoke of you often when he visited this branch. He believed in you completely. He said you were the only honest person in his family." Then he stepped out, closing the door softly behind him. I sat alone in that conference room, holding the envelope in trembling hands. The paper was heavy and cream-colored, the kind of stationery that cost more than the notepads I used at work. I slid my finger under the seal and extracted 3 pages covered in grandfather's neat script. The first words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I blinked them away and forced myself to read. "My dearest Marissa," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Your family has shown you who they truly are, and you have found your way to what I have left for you. I am sorry that I could not be there to explain everything in person. I am sorry that you had to discover the truth this way alone and probably frightened. But I need you to understand why I made the choices I made, and why you are the only person I trust to carry on what your grandmother and I started." The letter went on to describe the early years of my father's life before I was born, before my mother died in a car accident when I was only 3. Grandfather wrote about watching his son grow from a curious, kind-hearted boy into a man increasingly consumed by ambition and resentment. "Your father is not evil by nature," Grandfather explained, "but money changed him. When I won the lawsuit against the company that killed your grandmother, he believed he deserved to inherit everything immediately. He saw the settlement as his birthright, not as the result of a decade of fighting for justice. When I refused to hand it over, when I told him I would decide how and when to distribute my assets, he never forgave me. I thought about all the times I had heard my father speak about grandfather with barely concealed contempt. The dismissive comments about the old man being stuck in his ways, or impossible to reason with. I had assumed it was just the natural friction between generations. Now I understood it was something much darker. My father had been angry at his own father for 30 years, nursing a grievance that had poisoned every interaction between them. The second page of the letter contained a warning that made me stop breathing for a moment. "Marissa, I need to tell you something important about your stepmother. Victoria is not as dangerous as you think. I know you blame her for much of what has gone wrong in your family, but I have watched carefully over the years, and I have come to a different conclusion. Look more carefully at the person standing behind her. Your father has always been skilled at using others to do his dirty work. He lets Victoria take the blame while he pulls the strings from the shadows. Every cruel word she has spoken to you, every humiliation she has inflicted, I suspect your father was the architect. She is not innocent, but she is not the mastermind either." I set the letter down and pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything I had believed for years. All those moments when Victoria had said something cutting, when she had undermined me, or excluded me, or made me feel like an intruder in my own home. I had always assumed she was the source of the poison, but what if she had been following orders? What if my father had been directing her all along, using her as a shield to deflect blame while he orchestrated everything from behind his newspaper or his glass of evening whiskey? The thought was almost too painful to consider. It was one thing to be mistreated by a stepmother who had no biological connection to me. It was something else entirely to realize that my own father, the man whose blood ran through my veins, might have been deliberately destroying me for decades. The third page of the letter explained what I had wondered since the moment I saw the account balance. Why had grandfather never told me? Why had he let me struggle through years of feeling worthless and unwanted when he could have given me hope, given me resources, given me a way out? "I know you must be asking why I kept this secret from you," he wrote. "The answer is complicated, but I need you to understand it. I wanted you to develop your own strength, Marissa. I wanted you to become the woman I knew you could be without relying on money as a crutch. If I had told you about this inheritance, it would have changed you. You might have made different choices, taken different risks, become a different person. I needed to see who you would become when you believed you had nothing." He continued, "I also needed to see how your family would treat you when they believed you had nothing to offer them. Their cruelty toward you, the way they dismissed you and belittled you and made you feel like you did not belong, this was the proof I needed. It showed me that my decision was correct. They do not love you, Marissa. They never did. They only love what they can gain from others. You are different. You love without conditions. You give without expecting return. That is why you deserve this inheritance, and that is why they never will." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. My hands had stopped trembling. In their place was something new, something that felt like steel forming in my spine. Grandfather had seen me clearly when no one else had. He had believed in me when my own father tried to convince me I was worthless, and he had given me the tools to fight back. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from Derek, the first communication I had received from any family member since walking out into the rain. "Dad changed the locks," the message read, "and he is hiring a lawyer. You have no idea what you have started." I stared at Derek's message for a long moment, then turned off my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. My father was hiring a lawyer. He was preparing to fight. But fight for what? The trust documents were clear. The bank had confirmed my status as the sole heir, and grandfather had explicitly excluded my father from any claim to the assets. There was nothing for him to sue for, nothing he could legally take from me, unless he planned to attack from a different angle, unless he intended to destroy me in some other way. I left the bank with Mr. Ashworth's business card in my pocket and a head full of numbers I still could not fully comprehend. $29 million. I could walk into any luxury hotel in the city, book the finest suite, order champagne and room service, and never think about money again. I could buy a house, a car, an entirely new life. But something held me back. Perhaps it was grandfather's influence, his decades of modest living despite his hidden wealth. Perhaps it was simple caution, an instinct that told me to move slowly until I understood the full picture. Or perhaps it was just that I did not know how to be a person with money, and I was not ready to learn. Instead of a luxury hotel, I found a small motel on the outskirts of town. The Pinewood Lodge catered mostly to seniors traveling on fixed incomes, retirees passing through on their way to visit grandchildren or see old friends. The building was old but clean, with wood-paneled walls and bedspreads that looked like they had been chosen in 1985. The television in my room produced more static than picture, and the mattress sagged slightly in the middle. But when I walked through the door and breathed in the smell of aged wood and lavender cleaning products, something in my chest loosened. This place reminded me of grandfather's apartment. It felt safe in a way that no five-star hotel ever could. The motel owner was a woman named Louise, somewhere in her mid-60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perpetually perched on top of her head. She had been sitting behind the front desk when I checked in, working on a crossword puzzle with a cup of tea steaming beside her. When she looked up and saw my face, something shifted in her expression. "You have the look of someone who just lost their whole family," she said quietly. I had not expected the words to hit so hard, but suddenly I was crying, standing in the lobby of a rundown motel with tears streaming down my face, while a stranger watched with gentle, knowing eyes. Louise came around the desk without a word and guided me to a small sitting area with worn armchairs and a coffee table covered in old magazines. She sat me down, pressed a box of tissues into my hands, and waited. When the tears finally stopped, I found myself telling her everything. I do not know why I trusted her so quickly. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the shock of the past 24 hours, or simply the desperate need to talk to someone who was not connected to the nightmare my life had become. Whatever the reason, the words poured out of me like water through a broken dam. The dinner party, the humiliation, being thrown out in the rain, the card, the bank, the inheritance I still could not believe was real. Louise listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to respond. "I know something about being thrown away by family," she finally said. "My husband of 30 years decided one day that he wanted a younger wife, someone who made him feel powerful again. He came home from work, told me to pack my things, and change the locks the next morning. 30 years of marriage, 2 children, and I walked away with nothing but the clothes on my back and a broken heart." "How did you survive?" I asked. "One day at a time. I found work where I could. I learned that I was stronger than I ever knew, and eventually I bought this place." She gestured at the faded lobby with something like pride. "It is not much, but it is mine. No one can take it from me." Over the following days, Louise became my anchor. Each morning she would knock on my door and invite me to share breakfast in her small kitchen behind the office. Each evening she would sit with me in the lobby and we would talk for hours about life, about loss, about the strange ways that pain can transform into strength. She told me stories about the other guests who had passed through over the years, women, mostly many of them, escaping situations similar to my own. "You do not need to get revenge with cruelty," she told me one night. "I see that look in your eyes, the anger that wants to lash out. But trust me, the best revenge is living well. Let the truth speak for itself. People like your father, they destroy themselves eventually. You do not need to help them." I took her words to heart. During the day, I began researching my options, making lists of questions for Mr. Ashworth, trying to understand the legal landscape I now found myself navigating. I told Louise about my plans, about my fears, about the text message from Derek and what it might mean. She listened attentively, asking questions that seemed helpful at the time. Where did my father work? What kind of business was he in? How long had I been staying at the motel? Did anyone else know I was here? I answered every question without hesitation. It never occurred to me to wonder why she wanted to know. What I did not realize was that Louise had a daughter named Christine, a single mother with 2 young children, who rented a small house on the other side of town. And the landlord who owned that house, who held Christine's security and stability in his hands, was my father. When he discovered where I was staying when he traced me to this modest motel on the outskirts of his reach, he had contacted Louise with a simple ultimatum: keep him informed about his daughter's activities, or Christine would find herself homeless within the week. Louise had made her choice. She had chosen her daughter over a stranger she barely knew. I could not blame her for that, even later when the truth came out. But in those early days, I trusted her completely, and that trust would cost me more than I could imagine. On my 5th morning at the motel, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a crisp professional voice introduced himself as Thomas Hartwell, the attorney who had managed my grandfather's estate. "Miss Kelly," he said, "I apologize for not reaching out sooner. The trust protocols required that you make first contact with the bank before I could reveal myself. But now that you have been verified as the heir, there are matters we need to discuss urgently." "What kind of matters?" He paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Your grandfather left more than money, Miss Kelly. He left documentation evidence records that he compiled over many years. He left the truth about your family, and I believe you need to see it." His voice dropped lower. "Can you come to my office this afternoon?" "What I have to show you is not something we should discuss over the phone." Thomas Hartwell's office occupied the top floor of a brick building in the oldest part of downtown. The kind of neighborhood where law firms had been serving generations of the same families for over a century. The elevator was ancient and slow, giving me time to study the brass fixtures and wonder how many secrets had traveled up and down this shaft over the decades. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a reception area that smelled of leather and old paper, with dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced men lining the walls. A secretary led me down a hallway to a corner office where Mr. Hartwell was waiting. He was younger than I expected, perhaps early 50s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. His desk was immaculately organized, but behind him stood a massive safe that looked like it belonged in a bank vault rather than a law office. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I know this has been an overwhelming week for you, but what I need to show you could not wait any longer." "The bank manager said something similar," I replied. "He showed me the accounts, the investments. I still cannot quite believe any of it is real." Mr. Hartwell nodded sympathetically. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man. He spent 30 years building that portfolio while living like a monk. But the money is only part of what he left you. The rest is in there." He turned to look at the safe. "Your grandfather rented space in this vault for over 20 years. He came in once a month, regular as clockwork, to add documents and review what he had collected. He told me it was his insurance policy." "Insurance against what?" "Against the possibility that his family would try to destroy each other after he was gone." Mr. Hartwell stood and walked to the safe, entering a long combination with practiced fingers. "He never explicitly told me what was inside. Client confidentiality works both ways in situations like this, but he made it very clear that you and only you were to have access after his death. He said you would know what to do with what you found." The safe door swung open with a heavy metallic groan. Inside were stacks of folders, boxes of documents, and several sealed envelopes arranged with careful precision. Mr. Hartwell stepped aside and gestured for me to approach. "Take your time," he said. "I will be in the conference room next door if you need anything. This is yours now, Miss Kelly. Whatever is in there, it belongs to you." After he left, I stood alone in front of the open safe, feeling like an archaeologist about to disturb an ancient tomb. The first folder I pulled out was labeled Financial Records 1995-2000 in grandfather's neat handwriting. Inside were bank statements, transaction records, and photocopies of checks, all annotated with his observations. He had tracked every dollar that moved through the family accounts during those years, noting patterns and anomalies with the precision of a forensic accountant. The second folder covered the following 5 years, and the third covered the 5 after that. Grandfather had been monitoring his family's finances for decades, building a comprehensive picture of who spent what, who saved, who borrowed, and who lied. Property transfer documents showed real estate purchases I had never heard of. Letters between grandfather and various banks revealed accounts that had been opened and closed without his knowledge. Attempts by my father to establish credit lines using family assets as collateral. As I worked through the papers, a pattern began to emerge. Every few months there would be a spike in unusual activity, withdrawals from accounts that should have been untouchable, loan applications that were never discussed at family gatherings. And each spike corresponded to dates I remembered for entirely different reasons. The Christmas when my father had screamed at me for buying the wrong brand of coffee creamer. The Thanksgiving when he had called me a burden in front of the entire extended family. The birthday when he had refused to acknowledge my existence for the entire meal. I pulled out a sheet of paper where grandfather had drawn a timeline connecting his son's failed attempts to access the trust fund with the dates of major family arguments. The correlation was undeniable. Every time my father tried to steal from grandfather and failed, he came home and took his frustration out on me. Every cruel word, every humiliation, every moment when he made me feel worthless and unwanted had happened immediately after he was denied the money he believed he deserved. I had not been mistreated because I was inadequate. I had been mistreated because I was convenient. I was the outlet for his rage, the safe target for his disappointment, the person he could hurt without consequences. Deeper in the safe, I found documents that painted an even darker picture of my father's life. Credit card statements showing purchases at casinos, loan agreements with interest rates that bordered on predatory, letters from collection agencies that had been intercepted before they could reach the family home. My father, the respectable businessman, the church elder, the pillar of the community, had been hiding a gambling addiction for years. He had borrowed against everything he could touch, accumulating debts that would have destroyed his reputation if they ever became public. The most devastating discovery was a single sheet of paper near the bottom of the safe. It was written in grandfather's hand, dated just 2 years before his death, and it contained only 3 sentences. Daniel has changed beyond recognition. He is no longer my son. Only Marissa remains. I read those words over and over, tears blurring my vision. Grandfather had watched his own son descend into greed, and corruption had witnessed the transformation from the boy he raised into a man he no longer recognized. And in the end, he had made his choice. He had chosen me. But there was one more item in the safe that I had not yet opened. At the very back, behind all the folders and boxes, was a large manila envelope sealed with wax. Grandfather had written on the front in letters larger than his usual careful script, as if he wanted to make absolutely certain I would see it. For Marissa, the complete truth about your father. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling its weight, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately. Part of me wanted to put it back in the safe and pretend I had never seen it. But grandfather had left this for me. He had trusted me to handle whatever truth it contained. I slid my finger under the wax seal and broke it open. The envelope contained a letter, 8 pages long, written in grandfather's careful handwriting. Unlike the brief note I had read at the bank, this was dense with detail, every line filled edge to edge, as if he had so much to say that he could not waste a single inch of paper. I settled into the leather chair behind Mr. Hartwell's desk, took a deep breath, and began to read. My dearest Marissa, the letter began. If you are reading this, then you have found everything I hid from the world. You have seen the accounts, the investments, the evidence of what your family has become. But you do not yet know where this money came from or why I guarded it so fiercely. It is time for you to understand the truth about your grandmother, about me, and about the fight that defined the second half of my life. The next 3 pages told a story I had only heard fragments of before. Grandmother Eleanor had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer when she was just 52 years old. The doctor said it was unusual that the particular type of cancer she had was often linked to environmental toxins rather than genetics. Grandfather had refused to accept this as random misfortune. He began investigating, talking to neighbors, collecting water samples, digging through public records at the county courthouse. What he discovered was horrifying. A major manufacturing corporation had been dumping industrial waste into the local watershed for over a decade. The chemicals had seeped into the groundwater, contaminating the wells that supplied drinking water to hundreds of homes in their community. Grandfather found evidence that the company knew about the contamination and had chosen to hide it rather than pay for proper disposal. They had calculated that covering up the pollution was cheaper than cleaning it up, even if people got sick, even if people died. "Your grandmother fought alongside me for as long as she could," Grandfather wrote. "She wanted to see justice done. She wanted to make sure that no other family would suffer the way we were suffering. But the cancer was faster than the courts. She died 18 months after her diagnosis, still believing that we would win, still trusting that the truth would prevail." After Grandmother's death, Grandfather had thrown himself into the lawsuit with a fury that bordered on obsession. He mortgaged his house, sold his car, borrowed from friends and colleagues. He hired the best environmental attorneys he could find and fought the corporation through every appeal, every delay, every attempt to bury the case in procedural quicksand. The battle lasted nearly 10 years. There were moments when he was certain he would lose everything, when the legal fees mounted higher than he could pay, when he considered giving up. But he did not give up. He kept fighting, kept gathering evidence, kept pushing forward, even when everyone around him said it was hopeless. And in the end, he won. The jury awarded a settlement large enough to force the corporation to acknowledge what they had done. It was one of the first major environmental justice victories in the state's history. "This money came from tears," Grandfather wrote. "Every dollar represents a day that your grandmother suffered, a moment when she was in pain, a breath she struggled to take. I did not earn this fortune through clever investments or business acumen. I earned it by watching the woman I loved die slowly, and then by spending a decade making sure her death meant something. Do not let this money fall into the hands of those who do not understand the value of tears." The letter continued with an explanation of why Grandfather had chosen to hide his wealth rather than share it with the family. When the settlement was finalized, my father had immediately demanded his portion. He argued that as Grandfather's only son, he was entitled to at least half of the award. He spoke about investments he wanted to make, businesses. He wanted to start a lifestyle he believed he deserved. "I watched your father's eyes when he talked about the money," Grandfather wrote. "I saw no grief for his mother, no appreciation for what the settlement represented. I saw only greed, only hunger, only the calculation of how much he could take for himself. That was the moment I knew I could never give him a single dollar. That was the moment I understood that the son I raised had become a stranger." When Grandfather refused to share the settlement, my father's resentment had crystallized into something harder and colder. He began distancing himself from Grandfather, visiting less often, speaking with barely concealed contempt when they did interact. He started a campaign of subtle manipulation, trying to make Grandfather feel guilty for withholding the money, suggesting that he was being selfish and unreasonable. When those tactics failed, he simply waited, assuming that eventually Grandfather would die and the money would come to him by default. "Your father believes that money is power," Grandfather wrote. "He thinks that wealth can buy respect, can purchase loyalty, can compensate for every inadequacy and failure in his character. But true power is not found in bank accounts or property deeds. True power is knowing when to walk away from those who do not deserve you. True power is building a life based on integrity rather than acquisition. I have tried to teach you this, Marissa, in every conversation we shared and every afternoon we spent together. I hope you have learned it because you will need that strength in the days to come." The final page of the letter was shorter, more personal. Grandfather wrote about his heart condition, the diagnosis he had kept secret from everyone except his doctors and his attorney. The condition was degenerative, irreversible, and would eventually claim his life. He had known this for over 2 years before he died. "My illness is getting worse," he wrote. "The doctors have told me what to expect, and I have made my peace with it. But I have also made a decision about how I want to leave this world. I will not spend my final months in a hospital bed hooked up to machines, losing my dignity piece by piece. I have chosen my own path, and when you learn what that means, I hope you will understand." The words sent a chill through me. Grandfather had chosen his own path. What did that mean? Had he refused treatment? Had he made decisions about his care that hastened the end? Or was there something more, something I could not bring myself to consider? At the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, Grandfather had added a single line. "If you need the complete truth about my final days, find the nurse who cared for me. Her name is Patricia Yen. She will tell you what I cannot write." I set the letter down with trembling hands, my mind racing with questions I was not sure I wanted answered. And then my phone rang, an unknown number flashing on the screen. I answered without thinking. "Are you Marissa Kelly?" a woman's voice asked. "My name is Patricia. I was your grandfather's nurse. He told me to contact you after you found the documents." She paused, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. "There is something he wanted you to know. Something about how he died. Can we meet?" I agreed to meet Patricia the following week, but in the meantime, I found myself unable to sit idle. The revelations from Grandfather's files had ignited something inside me, a flame that demanded action rather than quiet contemplation. My father had spent decades building a reputation as an upstanding member of the community, a devoted family man, a pillar of the church. That reputation was built on lies, and I had the evidence to prove it. But I was not ready to expose the financial secrets, not yet. I needed to be strategic, to move carefully, to let the truth emerge in stages that would be impossible to dismiss or deny. I started with the simplest truth of all, my own story. Late one night at the motel, I opened my laptop and began to write. The words poured out of me with a fluency I had not expected, years of pain and confusion finally finding their voice. I wrote about the dinner party, about the public humiliation in front of neighbors and the church pastor. I wrote about being thrown out into the rain with nothing but a suitcase and the clothes on my back. I wrote about the years of being told I was worthless, a burden, a disappointment. I did not mention the inheritance, the bank accounts, or the millions of dollars I now controlled. This was not about money. This was about the truth of how my family had treated me, and the truth needed no embellishment. I posted the essay on a simple blog platform, expecting nothing. Perhaps a few friends would read it. Perhaps it would simply disappear into the vast ocean of the internet, another drop of pain among millions. But something unexpected happened. Within hours, the post had been shared dozens of times. Within days, it had been shared thousands of times. Women my age, women older than me, women who had experienced similar betrayals were reading my words and recognizing their own stories. The comments section filled with responses that made me weep. A 63-year-old woman from Ohio wrote that she had been disowned by her parents for marrying outside her religion and had not spoken to them in 30 years. A 58-year-old from California shared that her mother had told her on her wedding day that she would never amount to anything, and she had spent decades trying to prove her wrong. A 70-year-old grandmother wrote that reading my story had finally given her the courage to stop blaming herself for her own family's cruelty. I was not alone. I had never been alone. There was an entire community of women who understood exactly what I had experienced, who had survived similar wounds and emerged stronger on the other side. A week after the blog post went viral, I received an email from a woman named Sandra Mitchell. She hosted a podcast called Second Chapters, dedicated to women over 50 who were rebuilding their lives after major transitions. Divorce, widowhood, career changes, family estrangement. Sandra had built an audience of over 200,000 listeners who tuned in each week to hear stories of resilience and reinvention. She wanted to interview me. We recorded the episode on a Tuesday afternoon, speaking over video chat from my motel room. Sandra was in her early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that had clearly seen their share of pain. She told me before we started recording that she had been abandoned by her own family when she came out as gay in her 40s, that her parents had died without ever speaking to her again. She understood what it meant to lose the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours, though they would edit it down to 45 minutes for the final episode. I spoke calmly and factually without exaggeration or self-pity. I described the dinner party, the accusations, the moment when my father threw my suitcase into the rain. I talked about the years of emotional abuse, the constant criticism, the feeling of never being good enough no matter what I achieved. Sandra asked thoughtful questions that helped me articulate things I had never put into words before. Patterns of behavior I had accepted as normal because I had never known anything else. When the episode aired, the response was overwhelming. Thousands of comments poured in from listeners who had heard their own experiences reflected in my words. Women wrote to tell me that I had given them permission to stop blaming themselves, that hearing my story had helped them understand that the cruelty they endured was not their fault. The podcast climbed to the top of the charts in its category, and Sandra told me it was the most downloaded episode in the show's history. The ripple effects in my hometown were immediate and impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had been at that fateful dinner began talking. The Hendersons told other families on the street what they had witnessed that night, the way my father had raged at me in front of guests, the way he had thrown me out without a second thought. Pastor Williams found himself fielding questions from congregation members who wanted to know if the story they had heard on the podcast was true. At church the following Sunday, whispers followed my stepmother down the aisle. The women's group she had led for years suddenly found reasons to cancel their meetings. My father's carefully constructed image was beginning to crack. The email arrived on a Wednesday evening, sent from my father's personal account. The subject line was simply, "Stop," in capital letters. The message was brief and furious, demanding that I delete the blog post and refuse all future interviews. He accused me of lying, of exaggerating, of trying to destroy the family reputation for reasons he could not understand. He threatened legal action for defamation, though he did not specify what statements were untrue. I read the email 3 times before responding. When I finally typed my reply, I kept it simple. "I only told the truth," I wrote. "I have evidence to support everything I said. I have witnesses who were present that night. I have years of memories that I have never shared publicly but could if necessary. If you believe anything I said was false, I welcome you to specify which statements you are disputing, and I will provide documentation." His response came within minutes, a single paragraph that dripped with barely contained rage. "You think you're so clever," he wrote. "You think you can turn the whole world against me with your sob story. But you have no idea what I know about you, what secrets I've kept, what I could tell people about the kind of daughter you really are. If you don't stop this campaign immediately, I will tell the whole world exactly what you are. This is your final warning." I stared at the screen, reading his threat over and over. He was bluffing. He had to be bluffing. I had no dark secrets, no hidden sins that he could expose. I had lived a quiet, unremarkable life, working my administrative job, paying my bills, trying to survive in the shadow of a family that despised me. But even if he was bluffing, even if he had nothing to reveal, his threat told me something important. He was scared. For the first time in my life, my father was scared of me. I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled in weeks. The smile stayed with me through the night and into the next morning, a quiet ember of something that felt almost like power. My father had spent decades making me feel small and insignificant, convincing me that I had no voice, no value, no right to take up space in the world. But now the world was listening to me, and he could not stand it. His threatening email was not the response of a confident man defending his reputation. It was the desperate lashing out of someone who felt his control slipping away. I decided it was time to tighten the screws. Mr. Ashworth at the bank had explained my rights as the sole heir to grandfather's trust. The assets were mine legally and completely, but there were ongoing disbursements that had been established years ago. Monthly payments that went to various accounts, automatic transfers that had continued even after grandfather's death because no one had the authority to stop them, no one except me. I called Mr. Ashworth and requested a complete audit of all trust disbursements for the past 5 years. I wanted to know exactly where every dollar had gone, who had received payments, and under what justification. Within 48 hours, he sent me a preliminary report that made my jaw drop. My father and stepmother had been receiving monthly payments from grandfather's trust for over a decade. The payments were substantial, more than enough to cover their mortgage, their car payments, their country club memberships, and the lavish lifestyle they displayed to the community. The trust documents showed that grandfather had established these payments reluctantly under pressure from my father, who claimed he needed help with temporary business difficulties. But the difficulties had never been temporary. My father's business had been failing for years, propped up by a steady infusion of cash from the trust that no one outside the family knew about. The respectable businessman, the successful entrepreneur, the self-made man who lectured me about being a burden. He had been living on his father's money the entire time. I filed a formal request to freeze all disbursements from the trust pending a complete audit and review. As the sole legal heir, I had every right to do this. The trust assets belonged to me now, and I had a fiduciary responsibility to ensure they were being used appropriately. Mr. Ashworth warned me that this would cause immediate disruption to anyone who had been receiving payments, but I told him to proceed anyway. My family had shown me no mercy when they threw me out with nothing. I saw no reason to show them mercy now. The impact was faster and more dramatic than I had anticipated. 3 days after the freeze went into effect, I heard through the community grapevine that my stepmother had experienced a mortifying incident at an upscale boutique downtown. She had been shopping with a group of friends for someone's birthday, selecting expensive items with her usual confidence when her credit card was declined at the register. The card was linked to an account that drew from the trust disbursements. Without those monthly payments flowing in, the account had run dry. Victoria had stood there surrounded by her wealthy friends, unable to pay for the designer handbag she had already shown off on social media. The story spread through the women's network like wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone in their social circle knew that the Kelly family was having financial difficulties. The whispers that had started after my podcast interview grew louder and more pointed. People began connecting dots, wondering how a family that lived so extravagantly could suddenly be unable to pay their bills. My father received an even ruder awakening. The mortgage on their expensive house had been paid automatically from a trust account for years. When that payment failed to process, the bank sent a notice of default. For the first time in his adult life, my father faced the possibility of losing his home. I learned later that he had spent 3 days frantically calling banks and financial institutions, trying to secure emergency loans to cover the gap. His credit, it turned out, was not nearly as strong as his reputation suggested. And then there was Derek, my golden brother, who had never worked a real job in his life. His car payment had also been covered by trust disbursements, a fact I had not known until I saw the audit report. When the payments stopped, the dealership came to repossess his luxury SUV. Derek, who had mocked me as I walked out into the rain, who had laughed at my humiliation, was forced to take public transportation for the first time in his 28 years on Earth. The image of him standing at a bus stop in his designer clothes, waiting alongside the ordinary people he had always looked down upon, gave me a satisfaction I was not entirely proud of. But satisfaction was quickly replaced by concern when I discovered something troubling in the audit documents. My father had hired a private investigator 2 weeks after I was verified as the heir to the trust. The investigator's fees were being charged to a business account, but the purpose was clear from the invoice descriptions: surveillance, location tracking, background research. My father was having me followed. The investigator had found the Pinewood Lodge. He knew exactly where I was staying. I spent that evening in my room with the curtains drawn, trying to decide what to do. If my father knew my location, he might try to confront me directly. Or worse, he might try to pressure the people around me, use leverage against anyone who had shown me kindness. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Around 9 o'clock, I heard footsteps in the parking lot outside my window. I peeked through a gap in the curtains and saw Louise standing near the payphone at the edge of the property. She had her back to my room, but I could see that she was speaking urgently into her cell phone, her free hand gesturing in the air as if she was explaining something complicated. I cracked my window open just enough to hear fragments of her conversation. "She is still here," Louise was saying. "No, she has not said anything about leaving. Yes, I will let you know if anything changes. I understand. I am doing what you asked." She hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, her shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. Then she turned and walked back toward the motel office, passing directly beneath my window without looking up. I closed the curtain and sat down on the edge of my bed, my heart pounding against my ribs. Louise, the woman who had taken me in when I had nowhere else to go. The woman who had listened to my story with such sympathy, who had offered advice about letting the truth speak for itself, who had felt like the first real friend I had made in years. She was reporting to my father. She had been reporting to him all along. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the darkness of my motel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying Louise's phone conversation over and over in my mind. The woman who had seemed like a guardian angel when I arrived, broken and homeless, had been watching me the entire time, reporting my movements to the man who had thrown me out like garbage. Every cup of tea we shared, every conversation about resilience and moving forward, every piece of advice she offered had been part of a performance. I had trusted her completely, and she had betrayed me completely. But I did not confront her immediately. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I made any moves. I needed to see what my father would do with the information he had been gathering. I did not have to wait long. The next afternoon, a car pulled into the motel parking lot with a screech of tires that announced urgency bordering on panic. I watched from my window as my father climbed out of the driver's seat, his face red with barely contained rage. Victoria emerged from the passenger side, her makeup perfect but her eyes puffy as if she had been crying. And Derek unfolded himself from the back seat, his expression a mixture of contempt and something that might have been fear. They marched toward the motel office, and I knew they were asking Louise which room I was in. Seconds later, I heard footsteps pounding down the exterior walkway, and then a fist hammering on my door. "Marissa, open this door right now." I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and opened the door. They stood in a row like a firing squad, my father in the center with Victoria on his left and Derek on his right. They were dressed in their usual expensive clothes, but something was different. Victoria's designer blouse was wrinkled as if she had slept in it. My father's tie was crooked. Derek's eyes had dark circles underneath them that no amount of arrogance could hide. They looked diminished, somehow smaller than I remembered, as if the financial pressure of the past week had already begun to erode their foundations. "We need to talk," my father said, pushing past me into the room without waiting for an invitation. Victoria and Derek followed, and suddenly the small space felt suffocating with their presence. I closed the door and leaned against it, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not invite them to sit. I did not offer refreshments. I simply waited. "This has gone far enough." My father began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when he expected immediate compliance. "Whatever you think you're doing with the trust fund, it needs to stop. You're hurting this family." "I'm hurting the family," I repeated, keeping my voice flat and neutral. "The mortgage is overdue. Your stepmother's accounts have been frozen. Derek lost his car." He listed these grievances as if they were crimes I had committed against innocent victims. "We're your family, Marissa. Whatever happened between us, you can't just cut us off like this." Victoria stepped forward, and I watched her transform into the role she played best, the sympathetic matriarch, the peacemaker. The reasonable woman caught in the middle of a difficult situation. Tears began streaming down her perfectly powdered cheeks. "Marissa, sweetheart, I know things have been hard between us. I know there have been misunderstandings. But you're the only one who can save this family now. Please, we're begging you. Just unfreeze the accounts. Let the payments continue. We can work everything else out later." She reached for my hand and I stepped back instinctively. Her tears did not move me. I had seen this performance too many times before, the manufactured emotion that appeared whenever she wanted something and disappeared the moment she got it. "You're begging me," I said slowly, tasting each word. "The same people who threw me out with nothing are now begging me to save them." "We didn't throw you out," Victoria protested. "There was a misunderstanding, an argument that got out of hand. We never meant for you to actually leave." My suitcase was thrown into the rain. My father told me I was no longer part of the family and would receive nothing. There were witnesses. I looked at each of them in turn. That does not sound like a misunderstanding to me. My father's face darkened. The conciliatory approach was not working, so he shifted tactics, falling back on the intimidation that had always worked in the past. "Listen to me carefully, Marissa. If you don't fix this situation immediately, I will make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I'll tell them about your mental problems, your instability, your history of making up stories for attention. I'll destroy whatever credibility you've built with that podcast nonsense. And when I'm done, no one will believe a single word you say." I looked at him. This man who had raised me, who was supposed to protect me and support me and love me unconditionally. His face was twisted with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Behind the anger, I could see the fear. He was terrified, and that terror was making him dangerous. "You taught me something valuable," I said quietly. "You taught me to survive on my own. You told me over and over that I should expect nothing from family, that I was a burden, that I would never amount to anything. I learned that lesson well. I learned that I cannot count on any of you for anything. And I learned that the only person I can truly rely on is myself." Something shifted in the room. My father took a step toward me, and I saw his hand begin to rise. For a moment, I thought he was actually going to hit me right there in front of his wife and son, in a motel room where anyone might hear. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up the screen, clearly showing that it was recording. "Go ahead," I said calmly. "Strike your daughter. I'm sure that will help your reputation in the community." He froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. The rage in his eyes battled with calculation, the instinct for violence warring against self-preservation. Finally, slowly, he lowered his arm. "This isn't over," he said through clenched teeth. "You think you've won something, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." He turned and stormed out of the room, Victoria and Derek trailing behind him like debris caught in a hurricane. I listened to their footsteps recede, heard the car doors slam, watched through the window as they peeled out of the parking lot. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. But there was still one more confrontation I needed to have. I walked to the motel office and found Louise sitting behind the front desk. Her crossword puzzle abandoned, her hands trembling around a cup of cold tea. "Who were you calling last night?" I asked. Her face crumbled instantly, all pretense falling away. She could not deny it. She did not even try. "Please," she whispered, tears beginning to fall. "Let me explain. Your father, he threatened to throw my daughter out on the street. She has 2 young children. I had no choice. I stood there in the motel office, looking at this woman who had become my confidant, my advisor, the first person in weeks who had shown me genuine kindness. Or what I had believed was genuine kindness. Now her face was streaked with tears, her hands shaking so badly that tea sloshed over the rim of her cup onto the counter. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her confession. "Tell me everything," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, a calm that surprised even me. Louise set down her cup and pressed her palms against the counter as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "About 2 weeks ago, a man came to the motel asking questions. He said he was a private investigator working for a client who was trying to locate a family member. He showed me your picture, asked if I had seen you. I told him no, but he must have come back later because the next day your father called me directly." She paused, struggling to compose herself. He knew Christine, my daughter, rents a house from him on Maple Street. He's been her landlord for almost 4 years. The rent is too high, much higher than similar houses in the neighborhood, but Christine couldn't afford to move with 2 little ones. She's been barely scraping by, and your father knows it. He calls her every month to remind her that he could evict her any time he wants. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was uglier than I had imagined. My father had not just stumbled upon Louise as a potential informant. He had researched her, found her vulnerability, and exploited it with surgical precision. This was not the behavior of a desperate man lashing out randomly. This was calculated manipulation. He told me that if I didn't keep him informed about where you were and what you were doing, he would evict Christine immediately. No warning, no second chances. He said he would make sure she never rented anywhere in this town again. Louise's voice broke on the last words. My grandbabies, Marissa. They're only 4 and 6. I couldn't let them end up on the street. I know it was wrong. I know I betrayed your trust. But what would you do to protect your family? The question hung in the air between us, sharp and painful. What would I do to protect my family? The bitter irony was that I had never had a family worth protecting. The people who shared my blood had thrown me away without a second thought. But I understood what Louise meant. I understood the impossible choice she had faced, the weight of responsibility for people you love pressing down until you crack. A line from grandfather's letter surfaced in my memory. Words I had read just days ago, but that now felt like they had been written specifically for this moment. The measure of a person is not how they treat those who help them, but how they treat those who hurt them. I could be angry. I had every right to be angry. Louise had violated my trust in the most fundamental way possible, feeding my location and my plans to a man who wanted to destroy me. But anger would not change what had happened. Anger would not undo the betrayal or restore the sense of safety I had felt in this humble motel. And anger certainly would not help me become the person grandfather believed I could be. Tell me about the house, I said quietly. The one your daughter rents. Louise looked confused by the change of subject, but she answered anyway. It's a small place, 3 bedrooms on Maple Street near the elementary school. Your father bought it years ago as an investment. Christine moved in after her divorce because it was close to her job, and the schools were good for the kids. But the rent keeps going up. Last year he raised it by $200 with no warning. She's paying almost double what other houses on that street cost. And if she's ever late with payment, he threatens eviction every single time. He's shown up at her door at midnight demanding money. He's called her workplace and told her supervisors she might need time off to find new housing. He enjoys it, I think. The power he has over her. Louise wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I should have found a way to help her move somewhere else years ago, but I couldn't afford to help her, and she couldn't afford to leave. We've been trapped. I made a decision in that moment, a choice that surprised me even as I made it. The anger I had expected to feel was simply not there. In its place was something that felt almost like clarity, a crystalline understanding of what grandfather would have wanted me to do. I'm going to buy that house, I said. Louise stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. What? I'm going to buy the rental property your daughter lives in. I'll pay whatever your father is asking, and then I'll let Christine live there rent-free for 1 year while she gets back on her feet. After that, we can discuss a reasonable rent that won't bankrupt her. I don't understand. Louise's tears had stopped, replaced by utter bewilderment. After what I did to you, why would you help us? Your daughter didn't betray me. She doesn't even know I exist. You did what any mother would do when her child was threatened. I'm not going to punish Christine and her children for a choice you made under duress. I paused, searching for the right words. My grandfather taught me that true power isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about having the strength to show mercy when you don't have to. I'm choosing not to become like my father. I'm choosing to be like my grandfather instead. Louise broke down, completely sobbing so hard that her whole body shook. She came around the counter and grabbed my hands, squeezing them with a desperate grip. "I'm so sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry for everything. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Whatever you need, whatever I can do, I swear, I'll help you. I swear it." I let her hold my hands, let her cry herself out. When the storm of her emotions finally began to subside, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and said something that sent a chill down my spine. "There's something else you need to know. Your father isn't just threatening people like me. He's planning something much bigger." She lowered her voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "I heard him on the phone when he called me yesterday. He was talking to someone about lawyers, about lawsuits, about destroying your credibility permanently. And your stepmother, Victoria, she was in the background." I could hear her voice. "She sounded terrified of him, Marissa. Absolutely terrified. Whatever is happening in that family, it's much worse than you know." Louise's warning stayed with me through the night, circling in my mind like a vulture waiting for something to die. Victoria was terrified of my father. The woman I had spent years believing was the source of all the cruelty in my family, the mastermind behind every humiliation and slight, was apparently living in fear of her own husband. It did not align with anything I thought I knew about my family's dynamics. Victoria had always seemed so confident, so in control, so effortlessly cruel. The idea that she might be as much a victim as I was felt impossible to accept. 2 days later, I received a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, a familiar voice spoke in a hushed, urgent whisper. "Marissa, it's Victoria. Please don't hang up. I need to see you. Alone. There are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago." Every instinct told me this was a trap. Victoria had been part of the delegation that came to my motel room demanding I unfreeze the trust funds. She had cried her manufactured tears and played her role as the peacemaker caught in the middle. Why should I believe anything she said now? But something in her voice was different. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by a tremor of genuine fear that I had never heard from her before. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop on the other side of town, a place where neither of us was likely to be recognized. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall. The woman I saw bore little resemblance to the Victoria I knew. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her face was bare of makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes and lines of exhaustion around her mouth. She was wearing a plain sweater and jeans instead of her usual designer outfits. When she looked up and saw me approaching, I caught a flash of something in her eyes that might have been relief. "Thank you for coming," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't. Give me one reason why I should trust anything you say." Victoria nodded slowly, as if she had expected this response. "I don't expect you to trust me. I haven't earned that. But I hope you'll at least listen to what I have to tell you, because it changes everything you think you know about what happened." She pulled out her phone and navigated to a text message thread, then slid it across the table toward me. "Read this. It's from your father sent the afternoon of the dinner party, the one where you were thrown out." I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. The message was time-stamped 3 hours before that fateful dinner began. It read, "Tonight, you need to make her angry. Give me a reason to throw her out. Don't ask why, just do it. Just do." Below, that was Victoria's reply. "What if she doesn't get angry? What if she just apologizes?" And then my father's response. "Then push harder. I don't care what you have to say to her. Just make sure she loses her temper or refuses to back down. I need witnesses to see that she's the problem." I stared at the words until they blurred. The dinner party, the accusation of disrespect, the public humiliation in front of neighbors and the pastor. It had all been orchestrated. My father had planned every moment, had ordered Victoria to provoke me, had manufactured the entire confrontation as a pretext for throwing me out. "Why?" I managed to whisper. "Because he knew about your grandfather's money." Victoria's voice was barely audible. "He's known for over a year, ever since he started trying to access the trust. He figured out that you were named as the heir, that the account could only be activated if you presented the card yourself. He thought if he could cut you off from the family completely, if he could make you so angry and hurt that you would never want to contact any of us again, then maybe the trust would eventually default to him. Or at least you would never discover what you were entitled to. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Every cruel word, every calculated slight, every moment when I had blamed Victoria for making my life miserable had actually been directed by my father from behind the scenes. He was not a weak man manipulated by a domineering wife. He was a puppet master who had been using Victoria as his instrument for years. "I don't understand," I said. "Why would you go along with this? Why would you let him use you like that?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the exhaustion that lined her features. "Because I'm terrified of him, Marissa. I have been for years. When I married your father, I thought I was getting a stable, successful man who would take care of me. By the time I realized what he really was, it was too late. I had no career, no savings, no family of my own to fall back on. If I disobeyed him, he threatened to divorce me and leave me with nothing. He said he would destroy my reputation, tell everyone I was mentally unstable, make sure I couldn't even get a job as a waitress." She grabbed a napkin and pressed it to her eyes. "I know that doesn't excuse what I did to you. I know I participated in terrible things, but you have to understand I was trapped. Every cruel thing I said to you, every time I made you feel unwelcome in your own home, it was because your father told me to. He gave me scripts, sometimes actual words he wanted me to say. And if I didn't deliver them convincingly enough, he would punish me in ways you can't imagine." I sat in silence, trying to reconcile this broken woman in front of me with the confident villain I had hated for so long. Grandfather's warning echoed in my mind, words from his letter that I had not fully understood until this moment. "Your stepmother is not as dangerous as you think. Look more carefully at the person behind her." He had known. Somehow Grandfather had seen through the performance to the truth beneath. He had tried to warn me, but I had been too consumed by my own pain to really hear what he was saying. "Everything I believed was wrong," I said slowly. "All these years I thought you were the enemy, but you were just another one of his victims." Victoria nodded miserably. "I should have found a way to escape. I should have been braver. But by the time I realized how bad things were, I felt like there was no way out." She hesitated, her hands twisting the napkin into shreds. "There's one more secret. Something about Derek. I've kept it for so long, but after everything that's happened, I don't know if I should tell you." "What about Derek?" She looked up at me with eyes full of anguish. "He's not your father's biological son. But I don't know if I should explain. It might change everything." The coffee shop seemed to fade away, the ambient noise of other customers and clinking cups dissolving into a distant hum. I stared at Victoria, trying to process what she had just said. Derek was not my father's biological son. The golden child, the favored one, the heir apparent who could do no wrong, was not even related to the man who had showered him with love and privilege while treating me like an unwanted burden. "Tell me everything," I said. Victoria took a shaky breath and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "Before I met your father, I was engaged to someone else. His name was Michael. We were young and in love, or at least I thought we were. When I found out I was pregnant, I assumed we would get married sooner than planned. Instead, Michael disappeared. He left town without a word, and I never saw him again." She paused, her eyes distant with the memory of old pain. "I was 23 years old, pregnant and abandoned. My family was mortified. In those days in our social circle, an unwed mother was a scandal that could ruin not just me but my entire family's standing in the community. My parents were desperate to find a solution. And that solution was my father." Victoria nodded. "Daniel was ambitious and charming, but he didn't have money or connections. My family had both. They offered him a deal: marry me, claim the baby as his own, and in return he would gain access to the family business and social network. He agreed without hesitation." I tried to imagine my father as a young man calculating the advantages of marrying a pregnant woman he barely knew. It was disturbingly easy to picture. So your marriage was never about love? It was a transaction from the very beginning. Daniel got the business opportunities and social standing he craved. My family got to avoid scandal. And I got a husband who would never let me forget that he had done me a favor. Victoria's voice hardened. He held Derek's paternity over my head from day one. If I ever complained about how he treated me, if I ever threatened to leave, he would remind me that he could destroy me with a single revelation. He could tell Derek the truth, tell our friends and neighbors, ruin my relationship with my own son. The twisted logic of my family's dynamics was finally becoming clear. My father had not favored Derek out of genuine love. He had lavished attention and resources on my brother as a form of compensation, a payment for the secret he was keeping, a way of ensuring that Victoria remained compliant and grateful. Every birthday party, every expensive gift, every word of praise was part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain control. And that's why he hated me, I said slowly, the realization settling into my bones like ice. I'm his actual biological child. I'm the one who should have represented his legacy, his bloodline, his continuation. But instead of taking pride in me, he resented me. Victoria looked at me with something like pity. I think seeing you reminded him of how trapped he was. You were proof that he was stuck in a loveless marriage, obligated to raise another man's child, while his own daughter looked at him with eyes that saw too much. He took out his frustration on you because he could. Because you were the safe target. I thought about all the years of cruelty, the constant criticism, the relentless message that I was worthless and would never amount to anything. I had always assumed there was something wrong with me, some fundamental flaw that made me unlovable. Now I understood that the flaw had never been mine. It had been his. I was hated not because of who I was, but because of what I represented, the living reminder of a life my father had never wanted and could never escape. Does Derek know? I asked. No, Daniel made sure of that. He's been the perfect father to Derek in every public way, so no one would ever suspect the truth. And I've been too afraid to tell him. What would it do to Derek to learn that his entire identity is built on a lie, that the father who loved him so demonstrably isn't related to him at all, while the sister he's been taught to despise is his father's only real child? I considered the implications of this information. With a few words, I could detonate a bomb that would destroy my father's carefully constructed image. I could tell Derek the truth and watch his world crumble. I could share this secret publicly and complete the dismantling of the man who had tormented me for decades. The temptation was powerful, a dark satisfaction that whispered seductively in the back of my mind. But then I thought about Derek. Not the arrogant brother who had laughed as I walked out into the rain, but the person underneath that performance. He had been raised to believe certain things about himself, about his place in the family, about his relationship with his father. Those beliefs were lies, but they were not his lies. He was as much a victim of my father's manipulation as Victoria was, as I was. I'm not going to tell anyone, I said finally. Not Derek. Not the public, not anyone. This secret isn't mine to reveal. Victoria stared at me with naked disbelief. After everything that's been done to you, you're not going to use this. Using it would make me like him. It would mean destroying Derek's sense of self just to hurt my father. That's not who I want to be. I met her eyes steadily. Grandfather left me his fortune because he believed I had integrity. He believed I would use what he gave me to do good, not to inflict maximum damage on everyone who wronged me. I'm not going to prove him wrong. Victoria began to cry again, but these tears seemed different from before. There was something like hope in them, or perhaps relief, as if she had expected the worst and been given something unexpected instead. Why are you telling me all this now? I asked. After years of keeping these secrets, why come to me today? Victoria wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts fear and determination. Because your father is planning something. He's been on the phone with lawyers constantly talking about strategies for getting control of the trust for discrediting you completely. And yesterday, I heard him say something that terrified me. What did he say? He said that when this is all over, everyone will know that the problems in this family were Victoria's fault, that she manipulated him, lied to him, turned his daughter against him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He's going to blame everything on me, Marissa. He's going to sacrifice me to save himself. And I won't go down alone. Not anymore. Victoria's confession changed everything. The woman I had believed was my primary tormentor was herself a prisoner trapped in a web of blackmail and fear that my father had been weaving for over 3 decades. Now she was offering to become my ally to provide evidence and testimony that could help me hold my father accountable for what he had done. It was an alliance I never could have imagined, but one that made strategic sense for both of us. I spent the next week working with Mr. Hartwell and Mr. Ashworth to prepare a document that would fundamentally restructure my relationship with my father. We called it a restoration agreement, though in truth it was more like terms of surrender. Every clause was carefully crafted to be legally enforceable, while also giving my father a clear path to compliance if he chose to take it. The document required 3 things. First, a written admission that he had attempted to access grandfather's trust without authorization and had orchestrated my removal from the family in order to prevent me from discovering my inheritance. Second, the return of all belongings that had belonged to grandfather, including furniture documents, photographs, and any items of sentimental value that were currently in his possession. Third, he would vacate the house within 30 days, since that property was being maintained entirely through trust disbursements that he was no longer entitled to receive. I arranged to meet my father at Mr. Hartwell's office neutral ground where there would be witnesses, and where his temper would be somewhat constrained by professional surroundings. He arrived precisely on time wearing his most expensive suit, as if the armor of wealth could protect him from what was coming. When he saw the restoration agreement laid out on the conference table, his face cycled through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold fury that he struggled to contain. "This is absurd," he said, picking up the document and scanning its contents. "You can't force me to admit to things I didn't do. You can't throw me out of my own home." "It's not your home," I replied calmly. "The mortgage payments come from grandfather's trust, which is now entirely under my control. You have no independent claim to the property. If you refuse to leave voluntarily, I can simply stop the payments and let the bank foreclose. Either way, you won't be living there much longer." I watched him search for a counter-argument, some legal leverage he could use to push back. But Mr. Hartwell had been thorough. The trust documents were unambiguous about my rights as sole heir. My father had been living on borrowed money and borrowed time for years, and now both had run out. "You have 30 days to comply," I continued. "If you sign the agreement and follow its terms, this matter ends quietly. No public scandal, no criminal referrals, just a clean separation and an acknowledgement of the truth. And if I refuse, then I'll have no choice but to pursue other options. The documentation I have regarding your unauthorized access attempts your financial misconduct, and your manipulation of family members would be of great interest to several parties, including the IRS." The mention of the tax authority made him flinch. I knew from grandfather's files that my father had been underreporting income for years, using the trust disbursements to fund a lifestyle that his official earnings could never support. An IRS investigation would uncover far more than he wanted anyone to see. While my father stewed over the agreement, I had a separate conversation with Victoria. We met at the same coffee shop as before, and I laid out my offer with equal clarity. If she would provide documentation of my father's financial activities, including any records she had access to regarding his business dealings and trust manipulations, I would ensure she had a place to live and would not pursue any legal action against her for her participation in his schemes. Victoria accepted without hesitation. Her survival instinct, honed by decades of living under my father's control, recognized a lifeline when she saw one. She began gathering records that same day, pulling bank statements and correspondence from hiding places throughout the house that my father did not know she had discovered over the years. What surprised everyone, including myself, was what I chose not to include in the agreement. I did not demand public humiliation. I did not insist that my father be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I did not require him to grovel or beg or suffer in ways that would satisfy a desire for vengeance. "I don't understand," Victoria said when I explained this to her. "After everything he's done, why aren't you trying to destroy him?" "Because destruction isn't what I want," I replied. "I want acknowledgement. I want accountability. I want to separate myself from the toxic dynamic that has poisoned this family for decades. If I demanded blood, if I pushed for maximum punishment, I would become exactly the kind of person my father always accused me of being. Vindictive, ungrateful, cruel. I thought about grandfather's letter about his belief that true power lay not in domination, but in the wisdom to walk away from those who do not deserve you. My grandfather left me his fortune because he believed I had integrity. The best way to honor that legacy is to handle this situation with the same integrity he would have shown. That means being firm but fair. That means giving my father the chance to make things right, even if I doubt he'll take it. This measured approach paradoxically seemed to frighten my father more than any threat of destruction would have. A vindictive enemy is predictable. A calm, principled opponent is not. He could not understand why I was not trying to annihilate him, and that uncertainty made him more anxious than he had ever been. The 30-day clock began ticking. I returned to the motel where Louise had become a devoted ally, checking on me constantly and reporting any suspicious activity in the parking lot. The documents Victoria provided were damning a paper trail of deception stretching back years. Everything was falling into place. Then at 11 o'clock that night my phone rang. My father's number glowed on the screen. "You think you've won," he said when I answered. His voice was low and controlled, but underneath the calm I could hear something dangerous. "You think you've outmaneuvered me with your lawyers and your agreements and your pathetic little alliances? But you have no idea what I'm capable of, Marissa. No idea at all. Is that a threat? It's a promise. I built everything I have from nothing. I've crushed people who were far more powerful than you, and I will not let my own daughter take it all away from me." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "This isn't over. It's just beginning." My father's promise to fight back was not an empty threat. Within a week of receiving the restoration agreement, he had hired one of the most expensive litigation attorneys in the state, a man named Richard Crane, who had built his reputation on aggressive tactics and courtroom theatrics. The lawsuit they filed was breathtaking in its audacity, claiming that I had manipulated my grandfather during his final years, that I had used undue influence to change his estate plans, and that I had effectively stolen the family inheritance through fraud and deception. The legal claims were baseless. Mr. Hartwell assured me of that immediately. Grandfather's trust had been established and updated by independent attorneys who had documented his mental competence at every stage. There were witnesses to his decisions, medical records confirming his clarity of mind, and a paper trail that proved I had no involvement whatsoever in the creation of the trust. But my father was not trying to win in court. He was trying to win in the court of public opinion. The social media campaign began the same day the lawsuit was filed. Suddenly, posts began appearing on multiple platforms portraying me as a villain. They used old photos of me looking sullen or angry, taken out of context from family gatherings where I had been marginalized and mistreated. They featured carefully edited quotes from my podcast interview, stripped of context to make me sound vindictive and cruel. The narrative they constructed was simple and compelling. A greedy daughter had turned against her loving parents, stolen her grandfather's fortune, and was now trying to destroy the family that had raised her. I watched my carefully built support begin to erode. The same comment sections that had been filled with encouragement and solidarity after my original blog post and podcast interview were now flooded with skepticism and accusations. People who had praised my courage were suddenly wondering if they had been fooled. The tide of public opinion, which had seemed so firmly in my favor, was turning with frightening speed. Then Derek joined the attack and things got worse. My brother posted a video on his social media accounts that went viral within hours. He sat in what appeared to be our childhood living room, his eyes red as if he had been crying, his voice breaking with emotion. He spoke about how much our grandfather had meant to the family, how his memory was being dishonored by my actions. He described me as someone who had always been jealous and resentful, who had invented grievances to justify taking what did not belong to me. He begged viewers to see through my lies and help him save his family from destruction. It was a masterful performance. Derek had always been charming, always known how to present himself in the best possible light. Now he was using those skills to paint me as the aggressor and himself as the victim. The video accumulated hundreds of thousands of views and was shared by people who had never heard of our family before, but found the story of a daughter betraying her parents irresistible. For the first time since discovering my inheritance, I felt truly afraid. Not of my father's legal threats, which I knew were hollow, but of the realization that truth alone might not be enough to protect me. My father had money, resources, and a lifetime of experience manipulating people. He was willing to spend whatever it took to destroy my reputation, and there was a real possibility that he might succeed. Louise found me sitting in the motel lobby late one evening, staring at my phone as another wave of hateful comments rolled in. She sat down beside me without a word and placed a folder on the table between us. "I found something," she said quietly. "Something that changes everything." I opened the folder and found a stack of printed documents. Invoices from a public relations firm called Narrative Solutions dated from the past 2 weeks. Internal emails discussing strategy for a client, identified only by initials that matched my father's name. And most damning of all, a detailed communication plan with the explicit goal of destroying my credibility through coordinated social media attacks. "How did you get these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Louise hesitated. "My daughter, Christine, works as a receptionist at a law firm downtown. Not your father's lawyer, but a firm in the same building. She noticed some documents being couriered between offices and recognized your family name. She made copies before they were delivered." I flipped through the pages, my disbelief growing with each one. The emails were explicit about the manufactured nature of the campaign. One discussed hiring people to post negative comments under fake accounts. Another outlined a strategy for leaking misleading information to sympathetic journalists. A third contained draft scripts for Derek's viral video, complete with stage directions about when he should pause for emotional effect. The entire counterattack, the lawsuit, the social media campaign. Derek's tearful plea, all of it had been orchestrated by professionals who were being paid to destroy me. None of it was genuine. None of it was organic. My father had simply purchased a narrative and set it loose on the world. "This is evidence of coordinated defamation," I said slowly. "If I release this, it proves everything they've said about me is a manufactured lie." "It does more than that," Louise replied. "It proves your father is willing to pay money to hurt you. That's not the action of a loving parent wronged by his child. That's the action of someone desperate to maintain control at any cost." I sat with the folder in my lap, considering my options. I could release this evidence immediately and watch the tide of public opinion swing back in my favor. I could see the sympathy that Derek's video had generated evaporate as people realized they had been manipulated by a scripted performance. I could enjoy the satisfaction of exposing my father's deception to the world. But I thought about grandfather's advice about the importance of strategic patience, about choosing the right moment to reveal the right information. This evidence was valuable precisely because my father did not know I had it. If I used it too soon, I might win a battle, but lose the opportunity to win the war. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Mr. Hartwell. "I've reviewed the documents Louise found," he said without preamble. "Combined with what Victoria has provided and what we already have from your grandfather's files, We have more than enough to file a countersuit. Your father's lawsuit is frivolous and potentially malicious. We could pursue him for defamation, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." He paused, and I could hear him choosing his next words carefully. "But I need to know something before we proceed. How far are you willing to go with this, Marissa? Because once we start down this path, there's no turning back." I told Mr. Hartwell I was willing to go as far as necessary, but I wanted to do it my way. The countersuit could wait. Before engaging in another legal battle that would drag on for months or years, I wanted to reclaim the narrative in the arena where my father had attacked me most effectively. I wanted to face him in public with the whole world watching. Sandra Mitchell, the host of Second Chapters, had been reaching out to me ever since my father's lawsuit made headlines. Her podcast had grown enormously after our first interview, and she was eager to address the controversy that now surrounded my story. She proposed a live episode, something she had never done before, where we would discuss the accusations my father had made and give me an opportunity to respond in real time. The announcement of the live episode drew immediate attention. Within hours, thousands of people had registered to watch the stream. The comment sections on every platform were divided between those who still believed me and those who had been swayed by my father's campaign. Journalists began asking for interviews. The story of the Kelly family had become a cultural moment, a referendum on family loyalty, inherited wealth, and the question of who deserves to tell their own story. I prepared meticulously. I gathered the documents I would need, selected the passages from grandfather's letters that would be most impactful, and practiced staying calm under pressure. I knew my father would try to disrupt the broadcast somehow. He could not afford to let me speak unchallenged to an audience of this size. The only question was how he would attack. The live episode began at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening. Sandra introduced me warmly but professionally, acknowledging that there were serious accusations on both sides and promising that we would address them honestly. The viewer count climbed steadily as we talked, passing 10,000, then 20,000, then numbers. I stopped being able to track. We were about 40 minutes into the broadcast when the disruption came. Sandra's producer interrupted to say there was a caller who claimed to be my father and was demanding to be put on the air. Sandra looked at me, asking silently if I was willing to take the call. I nodded. This was the moment I had been preparing for. My father's voice came through the speakers, confident and controlled. "Good evening, Sandra. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to set the record straight about my daughter's allegations." Sandra maintained her professional composure. "Mr. Kelly, thank you for calling in. What would you like to say?" "I want to say that everything Marissa has told you is a distortion of the truth. She was not thrown out of our home. She left voluntarily after a minor disagreement and has been using that incident to manufacture a victim narrative ever since. My father's estate was never meant for her alone. She manipulated an elderly man in his final years and convinced him to change his will. What she's doing is elder abuse, plain and simple." I listened to him speak, marveling at how smooth and persuasive he sounded. If I did not know the truth, if I had not seen the evidence with my own eyes, I might have believed him myself. He was doing exactly what he had always done, constructing a reality that served his purposes and presenting it with absolute conviction. When he finished, Sandra turned to me. "Marissa, how do you respond?" I took a deep breath and picked up the documents I had prepared. My grandfather anticipated that my father would try to claim the inheritance for himself. He documented everything, including the multiple attempts my father made to access his accounts without authorization. I'd like to read from my grandfather's own words. I began reading from the letter grandfather had left in the lawyer's safe. Not the private sections about his illness or his feelings toward me, but the factual documentation he had compiled. On March 15th, my son Daniel attempted to access my trust account by presenting himself as my authorized representative. He was denied. On June 3rd, he returned with a lawyer and demanded information about my assets, claiming I was mentally incompetent, and he needed to take control for my own protection. He was denied again. On September 22nd, He called the bank and attempted to impersonate me in order to transfer funds. The audience numbers were climbing rapidly as I read. Comments were flooding in faster than anyone could track them. My father interrupted, his voice losing some of its polish. "Those documents could be forgeries. You have no proof that—" "I have the bank's security logs," I said calmly. "I have the sworn statements of the employees who witnessed these attempts. I have correspondence from my grandfather to his attorney expressing his concern that his son was trying to steal from him." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. My grandfather wrote in his journal that his son had become a stranger to him. He wrote that he could not trust his own child with the legacy he had built. He designed the trust specifically to prevent my father from ever accessing it. "This is outrageous." My father's voice had risen, the careful control slipping away. "I am not going to sit here and let my daughter slander me on a public broadcast. I will sue everyone involved in this production. I will—" "Mr. Kelly," Sandra interrupted firmly, "threatening legal action against a podcast for allowing your daughter to respond to accusations you made publicly is not going to help your case." My father continued ranting, his words becoming increasingly incoherent as his anger overwhelmed his ability to maintain the facade. He accused Sandra of bias, accused me of being mentally unstable, accused everyone of conspiring against him. With every word he revealed more of the person he truly was beneath the respectable surface. By the time the broadcast ended, the #Justice for Marissa was trending across multiple platforms. The comments that had been so divided when we started were now overwhelmingly supportive. People who had doubted me were apologizing, admitting they had been fooled by my father's manufactured campaign. The tide had turned so completely that even I was stunned by the magnitude of the shift. I sat alone in the motel room afterward, emotionally exhausted but strangely peaceful. My phone buzzed constantly with messages of support and interview requests, but I ignored them all. I needed time to process what had just happened, to understand that the battle I had been fighting was finally turning in my favor. Then a text message arrived from an unknown number. The words on the screen made my heart stop. "This is Patricia, your grandfather's nurse. We spoke briefly before, but I wasn't ready to tell you everything. I have something your grandfather left specifically for you, a recording he made in his final days. But I need to warn you, Marissa. The truth about how he died might not be what you want to hear." Patricia had suggested we meet at a small park near the hospital where she still worked. It was a quiet place, she said, where patients' families often came to process difficult news. The location seemed appropriate given what she had hinted about in her message. I arrived early and found a bench beneath an old oak tree, watching leaves drift down in the autumn breeze while I waited for answers I was not sure I was ready to hear. She appeared exactly on time, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. She carried a small box under one arm, the kind used for storing important documents, and she sat down beside me without any of the small talk that strangers usually exchange. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "I should have reached out sooner, but I needed time to decide if I was doing the right thing. Your grandfather made me promise to give this to you, but only if you came looking for answers. He said you would know when you were ready." I looked at the box in her hands. "What's inside?" "The truth about his final days." She set the box on the bench between us. "Your grandfather knew he was dying, Marissa. His heart condition was terminal. The doctors had given him perhaps 6 months, maybe less, if he continued to decline at the rate he was going. He could have spent those months in and out of hospitals, hooked up to machines, fighting for every breath. Many people would have chosen that path. But he didn't." Patricia shook her head slowly. "He told me that he had lived his life on his own terms, and he intended to leave it the same way. He didn't want his final months to be defined by suffering and dependence. He didn't want you to remember him as a frail old man gasping for air in a sterile hospital room. So he made a choice." She opened the box and removed a small digital recorder, the kind that journalists use for interviews. He recorded this about 3 weeks before he passed. He wanted you to hear it in his own voice, not filtered through anyone else's interpretation. My hands trembled as I took the recorder from her. The device was old and slightly battered, the kind of thing Grandfather would have owned for years without ever considering an upgrade. I pressed play. His voice filled the quiet space around me, and suddenly he was there again, as real as if he were sitting beside me on this bench. Marissa, my dear granddaughter, if you're listening to this, then everything has happened the way I expected it would. You've found the inheritance. You've discovered who your family really is. And now you're searching for answers about how I died. There was a pause, and I heard him take a slow, labored breath. I want you to know the truth, because I don't want you carrying guilt or suspicion that doesn't belong to you. I chose when and how to leave this world. My doctors told me I had months of suffering ahead, months of hospitals and procedures, and the slow erosion of everything that made me who I am. I chose instead to stop treatment and go peacefully on my own terms in my own home. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I did not wipe them away. I needed to hear every word. Don't blame anyone for my death. Not the doctors, not the nurses, not your father, not anyone. This was my decision made with full knowledge of what it meant. I had a good life, Marissa. A life filled with love and loss and the satisfaction of knowing that I fought for what was right. When your grandmother died, I promised her I would see justice done. I kept that promise, and when my time came, I wanted to join her with dignity, not as a shadow of the man she loved. The recording continued for several more minutes, Grandfather reminiscing about his life, offering final words of advice, telling me how proud he was of the person I had become. By the time it ended, I was sobbing openly, grief and relief and love all tangled together in a knot I could not untangle. Patricia waited patiently until I had composed myself enough to speak. He made his choice, she said gently. No one forced him. No one hastened his end. He simply decided that he had lived enough and suffered enough, and it was time to let go. But my father, I managed. Victoria. They were there in his final days. They did not kill him, Patricia interrupted firmly. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Your grandfather's death was natural, the result of a heart that had simply worn out after 87 years of beating. What your father and stepmother did was different. They exploited his death. She pulled a folder from the box and handed it to me. Inside were copies of financial documents, transaction records, authorization forms dated in the days immediately before and after grandfather's death. While your grandfather was in his final decline, your father was conducting financial transactions. He was trying to move money, establish claims, create paper trails that he hoped would give him leverage over the estate. He didn't kill his father, but he was certainly preparing to profit from his death. Her voice hardened slightly. He visited the hospital once during your grandfather's final week. Once. And that visit lasted less than an hour, most of which he spent making phone calls in the hallway. The distinction mattered to me more than I could express. My family was guilty of greed, of betrayal, of treating a dying man as nothing more than an obstacle to be waited out. But they were not murderers. The darkness in their hearts had limits, even if those limits were defined more by cowardice than by conscience. There's one more thing, Patricia said. She reached into the box and withdrew a small USB drive. Your grandfather made another recording about 2 weeks before he died. This one is different. He said you should only open it when you're ready to finish what he started. I took the USB drive and turned it over in my hands. It was such a small thing, this piece of plastic and metal, but I could feel the weight of whatever secrets it contained. What's on it? Patricia shook her head. He never told me. He only said that when you were ready, you would know what to do with it. And he said to tell you this: the truth is the most powerful weapon you have. Use it wisely. I kept the USB drive in my pocket for 3 days before I found the courage to plug it in. Patricia's words echoed in my mind constantly. the instruction that I should only open it when I was ready to finish what grandfather had started. But what did that mean? What had he started that remained unfinished? I had already discovered the inheritance exposed my father's lies on a public broadcast and begun the process of reclaiming my life. What more could there possibly be? On the fourth day, I woke before dawn with a strange certainty that the time had come. I made coffee in the small pot Louise kept in the motel office, returned to my room, and inserted the USB drive into my laptop. There was only one file on it, an audio recording dated approximately 2 weeks before grandfather's death. The file was labeled simply, "For Marissa the Truth." I pressed play. For a moment there was only the ambient sound of grandfather's apartment, the familiar creak of his leather chair, the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then I heard his voice, weaker than I remembered, but still carrying that unmistakable authority. "Daniel, thank you for coming. Please sit down." My father's voice responded, impatient and dismissive. "I don't have much time, Dad. What is this about?" "It's about the money, the trust. I know what you've been doing." A pause. When my father spoke again, his voice had shifted, becoming carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't insult my intelligence." Grandfather's voice was firm despite its weakness. "I've tracked every unauthorized withdrawal, every attempt to access accounts you have no right to touch. The gambling debts you've hidden from Victoria. The business losses you've covered up with money that doesn't belong to you. I know all of it, Daniel." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. I could almost feel my father calculating his options, deciding how to respond. "I was going to pay it back," he finally said. His voice had changed again, becoming smaller, almost childlike. "Every dollar. I just needed time to get my business back on track. You know how hard things have been. The economy, the competition, excuses," grandfather interrupted. "You've always had excuses. When you were young, it was your teachers who didn't understand you. Then it was your employers who didn't appreciate you. Then it was the market, the government, your competitors. Never once have you taken responsibility for your own failures." "That's not fair." My father's voice rose with indignation. "I've worked hard my whole life. I've provided for my family. You've provided with my money. For years you've been living on disbursements from my trust while pretending to the world that your success was self-made. I allowed it because I hoped you would eventually find your footing, become the man I raised you to be. But you haven't changed. You've only become more dependent and more resentful." I heard my father stand up, heard the creak of furniture as he paced. "So what are you going to do? Cut me off? Tell everyone your own son is a failure and a thief?" "I'm not going to expose you publicly. Despite everything, you're still my son. I won't humiliate you in front of the community." Grandfather paused, and I heard him take a labored breath. "But I also won't let you take any more. When I die, everything goes to Marissa. The trust, the investments, all of it. You will receive nothing." The explosion of anger that followed made me flinch, even though I was listening to a recording months after the fact. Marissa. That girl. She's nothing. She's a nobody, who's never accomplished anything in her entire pathetic life. She works a dead-end job and lives like a mouse afraid of her own shadow. Why would you give her everything and leave me, your own son, with nothing? Grandfather's response was sad but unwavering. Because she will prove you wrong. She has something you lost long ago, Daniel. Integrity, compassion, the ability to see beyond her own desires. I've watched her grow up in the shadow of your cruelty, absorbing your insults and your dismissals, and she has never become bitter. She has never lost her kindness. Kindness doesn't pay bills, my father spat. No, but it builds a life worth living. One day, Daniel, you will see that your cruelty toward her was your greatest mistake. You had a daughter who could have loved you, who wanted nothing more than to be part of this family, and you threw her away because you couldn't stand having someone in your life who reflected the man you should have been. The recording continued for a few more minutes, my father arguing, threatening, pleading, and grandfather remaining steadfast. Eventually, my father stormed out, slamming the door so hard that I could hear the picture frames rattle on the walls. Then there was only silence and grandfather's voice speaking directly to me. Marissa, if you're listening to this, then you found everything I left for you. I want you to know that I never doubted you. Not for a single moment. I saw who you were when you were just a child, and I saw who you would become. Your father tried to convince you that you were worthless, but I always knew the truth. You are the best of us, the only one worthy of carrying on what your grandmother and I built together. I played the recording again, and again, and again. Each time the tears came harder, but they were not tears of anger or grief. They were tears of recognition, of validation, of finally understanding that I had never been alone. Even when I felt most abandoned, Grandfather had been watching, believing, preparing a future for me that I could not have imagined. He had seen who I would become before I saw it myself. He had wagered his entire legacy on a granddaughter that everyone else dismissed as worthless. And he had been right. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my motel room feeling something shift inside me. The fear that had accompanied me through this entire ordeal was gone, replaced by a calm certainty. I knew what I needed to do. I knew how this story would end. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Hartwell. "It's time," I said when he answered. "Time to end this. All of it." I did not release the recording to the public. After everything my father had done, after all the pain he had inflicted, and the lies he had told, I still could not bring myself to destroy him completely in front of the entire world. Perhaps it was weakness. Perhaps it was the last remnant of the daughter who had spent decades hoping her father might someday love her. Or perhaps it was simply the influence of Grandfather, whose voice still echoed in my mind, urging me to use the truth wisely rather than as a weapon of mass destruction. Instead, I sent the audio file directly to my father's personal email with a message that took me hours to compose. "I know everything," I wrote. "I have Grandfather's recording of your conversation. I have documentation of every financial transaction you tried to hide. I have witnesses who will testify to your behavior. You have 1 week to sign the restoration agreement and leave the house quietly. If you don't, this recording goes to the IRS, to your business partners, to every news outlet that has covered our story. I'm giving you a chance to preserve whatever dignity you have left. It's more than you ever gave me." I did not expect him to respond. I expected him to ignore my ultimatum to continue fighting to launch another counterattack through his expensive lawyers and his manufactured social media campaigns. But something had changed. The live podcast confrontation had damaged him more severely than I realized. The tide of public opinion had turned so decisively against him that even his most loyal supporters were beginning to distance themselves. The collapse began slowly, then accelerated with terrifying speed. The IRS opened an investigation into irregularities in the family trust disbursements. Someone, likely Victoria, fulfilling her end of our agreement, had provided them with documentation that raised serious questions about unreported income and improper use of trust funds. My father received notification of the investigation 3 days after my email, and I heard from Louise that he had spent the entire night pacing his study, making frantic phone calls to accountants and lawyers who had no good news to offer. His business partners were the next to abandon him. The podcast scandal had made them nervous, but they had been willing to wait and see how things played out. When rumors began circulating about the IRS investigation, when whispers spread through the business community about financial misconduct and family fraud, they decided they could not afford to be associated with him any longer. 2 major deals that had been in negotiation for months collapsed within a single week. A third partner, someone my father had known for over 20 years, called to say he was dissolving their joint venture effective immediately. The church board delivered their verdict on a Sunday morning, asking my father to resign from his leadership position to avoid bringing scandal upon the congregation. He had been an elder for 15 years, had served on every committee, had donated generously and visibly to every building fund and charity drive. None of it mattered. The board members who had once treated him with deference now could not meet his eyes. They spoke of protecting the church's reputation, of avoiding distractions from the ministry of praying for his family during this difficult time. They did not mention the podcast or the viral videos or the trending hashtags. They did not have to. Victoria filed for legal separation the same week. I learned about it from Mr. Hartwell, who had been in contact with her lawyers as part of our ongoing arrangement. She was not seeking a divorce, not yet, but she was establishing her independence, creating legal distance between herself and the man she had been terrified of for 3 decades. The separation meant she could testify against him if necessary, could cooperate with investigators without the complications of spousal privilege. It also meant she was finally, after all these years, beginning to escape. The community reaction was perhaps the most devastating of all. My father had spent his entire adult life cultivating a reputation as a respectable, successful, generous member of society. That reputation evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. Neighbors who had attended the dinner where I was humiliated now crossed the street to avoid him. The men he played golf with stopped returning his calls. The couples who had been dinner party regulars for years suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever he tried to arrange gatherings. Even Derek was not immune. His emotional video defending our father had backfired spectacularly after the live podcast exposed the manufactured nature of the campaign against me. His friends, many of whom had shared his posts and amplified his message, were embarrassed to have been fooled. They distanced themselves quietly but unmistakably, declining invitations, failing to respond to messages, treating him with the polite coldness reserved for people who have become socially toxic. The family that had once seemed to have everything, the beautiful house, the successful business, the loving church community, the endless social connections, now had nothing but empty rooms and unanswered phones. They had built their lives on a foundation of lies and manipulation, and that foundation had finally crumbled. I watched all of this unfold from a distance, receiving updates from Louise, from Victoria, from Mr. Hartwell, from the occasional news article that mentioned the ongoing Kelly family saga. I felt many things as I observed my father's destruction, but satisfaction was not among them. There was sadness for what could have been for the family we might have had if different choices had been made. There was relief that the truth was finally known, that I no longer had to carry the weight of secrets and suspicions. And there was a strange, quiet peace, the knowledge that justice had been served not through vengeance, but through the simple, relentless power of truth. 1 week after my ultimatum, a letter arrived at the motel. It was handwritten, the first personal communication I had received from my father that was not filtered through lawyers or social media. His handwriting was shaky, almost unrecognizable compared to the bold strokes I remembered from birthday cards and permission slips. "Marissa," he wrote, "I need to see you one last time. Everything I built is gone. My business, my reputation, my marriage, my standing in the community. I have nothing left. I know I don't deserve anything from you. I know I've done terrible things that can never be undone. But I'm asking as your father for one final conversation. Please. I have nothing left to lose. And there are things I need to say to you before I can figure out how to live with what I've become." I did not respond to my father's letter immediately. There were things that needed to happen first, pieces that needed to fall into place before I could face him again. The most important of these was the house itself, the physical embodiment of all the pain and rejection I had endured, the place where I had been told I was worthless and thrown out into the rain with nothing. The foreclosure proceedings had begun weeks earlier, an inevitable consequence of my father's inability to maintain the mortgage payments once the trust disbursements were frozen. He had tried desperately to refinance, to find alternative funding, to delay the inevitable through legal maneuvering. But his credit was destroyed, his business partnerships dissolved, and no bank was willing to extend new loans to a man under IRS investigation. The house that had been the symbol of his success was about to be taken away. I contacted Mr. Hartwell and asked him to handle the purchase quietly. Rather than waiting for the public auction where the property would be sold to the highest bidder, I arranged to pay off the outstanding debt directly through the Kelly Promise Foundation, the nonprofit organization I had established with grandfather's money. The foundation would own the house, not me personally, which meant it could never be entangled in family disputes or legal challenges. It also meant that the property would serve a purpose larger than any individual's needs. The day I walked through the front door was overcast and cool, the kind of autumn afternoon that made the house look smaller and grayer than I remembered. The key felt strange in my hand, a weight that represented both ownership and memory. I turned it in the lock and pushed the door open, stepping into the foyer where I had stood so many times as a child, as a teenager, as an adult, never once feeling like I truly belonged. Memories flooded back with overwhelming intensity. The corner where I had hidden during my father's rages, making myself as small as possible, hoping he would forget I existed. The dining room where I had been humiliated in front of neighbors, and the church pastor accused of sins I had never committed. The staircase I had climbed thousands of times, always feeling like a guest in a house that should have been my home. But there were other memories too, ones I had buried beneath layers of pain. The kitchen where grandfather had taught me to make his famous apple pie patient, and encouraging even when I made mistakes. The backyard where we had planted tomatoes together one summer, checking on them every day until they were ready to harvest. The living room where he had read to me on rainy afternoons, his voice bringing stories to life in ways that made the rest of my difficult childhood disappear for a few precious hours. I made my way to grandfather's old study, a room that had always been off-limits during my childhood. The door was closed but unlocked, and when I pushed it open, I found everything exactly as he had left it. His leather chair worn smooth by decades of use, his desk still cluttered with papers and pens, and the small brass clock that had belonged to his father. The bookshelves lined with volumes on history and finance and philosophy books he had spent his life collecting and reading. In the corner stood a cabinet I had never noticed before, or perhaps had simply forgotten about. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a small hook behind grandfather's desk exactly where he would have put it. I opened the cabinet and found treasure more valuable than anything in his bank accounts. Photo albums, dozens of them spanning decades. But these were not family albums filled with posed portraits and holiday gatherings. These contained only pictures of me and grandfather. Birthday parties where he was the only adult smiling at the camera. Fishing trips to the lake where we had spent entire days in comfortable silence. Quiet afternoons in this very study, me curled up in the leather chair with a book while he worked at his desk. A visual record of every moment we had shared, carefully preserved and hidden from the rest of the family. Beneath the albums was a journal leather-bound and filled with grandfather's familiar handwriting. I opened it at random and found an entry dated 15 years ago. "Marissa visited today," he had written. "She's struggling at school not because she lacks intelligence, but because she lacks confidence. Her father has convinced her that she's worthless, and she's beginning to believe it. But I see something in her that no one else does. She has strength she doesn't know yet. One day, when the time is right, she will show the world who she really is. I only hope I live long enough to see it." I sat on the floor of that study, surrounded by evidence of a love I had always felt but never fully understood, and I wept. Not tears of grief or anger, but tears of gratitude for a man who had seen me clearly when I could not see myself, who had believed in my future when I had none. When the tears subsided, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with this house. It would not become my home. It would not be sold to strangers. It would become the headquarters of the Kelly Promise Foundation, a place dedicated to helping women who had been abandoned or abused by their families. The rooms where I had been told I was worthless would become spaces where other women were told they had value. The dining room where I had been humiliated would become a gathering place for support groups and counseling sessions. The study where grandfather had documented his hopes for me would become an office where social workers helped women rebuild their lives. The place of my greatest trauma would become a place of healing for me and for others who had suffered similar wounds. I was standing in the foyer, already making mental notes about renovations and programs and staffing needs, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me. No one knew I was here except Mr. Hartwell and Louise, and neither of them would arrive unannounced. I opened the door and found Derek standing on the porch. He was alone without Victoria, or my father without the expensive car or designer clothes that had always been his armor. His eyes were red and swollen, his hair uncombed, His shoulders slumped with a weight that seemed too heavy for him to carry. He looked nothing like the arrogant golden child who had laughed as I walked out into the rain. "Marissa," he said, his voice cracking. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside and let him enter, watching as he looked around the foyer with an expression of bewildered loss. This had been his home too, the place where he had grown up as the favored child, the golden son, the heir to everything our father claimed to have built. Now it belonged to a foundation run by the sister he had spent his life dismissing, and he was standing in it like a stranger seeking shelter from a storm. We sat in the living room on opposite ends of the same couch where our family had once gathered for Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations. The silence between us was heavy with years of history, most of it painful, none of it simple. "Mom told me," Derek finally said. His voice was flat, emptied of the confidence that had always defined him. "During one of their fights when everything was falling apart, she just blurted it out like she couldn't hold it in anymore. She told me that Dad isn't my real father, that she was pregnant before they got married, that their entire marriage was some kind of business arrangement to cover up the scandal." I watched his face as he spoke, searching for the arrogance I had always seen there. It was gone, replaced by something raw and wounded that I had never witnessed in him before. "My whole life has been a lie," he continued. "Everything I believed about myself, about my place in this family, about why I deserved more than you. It was all built on something fake. Dad didn't love me because I was his son. He loved me because I was part of a deal he made with Mom's family. I was a prop in his performance just like everything else." He looked up at me, then his red-rimmed eyes searching my face for something I was not sure I could give him. "You knew, didn't you? Mom said she told you weeks ago? You've had this information the whole time. You could have destroyed me with it. You could have posted it online, told the newspapers, made sure everyone knew that the Kelly golden child wasn't even a real Kelly." His voice cracked on the last words. "Why didn't you? After everything I did to you, all those videos I made, all those horrible things I said. Why didn't you take your revenge when you had the chance?" I considered my answer carefully before speaking. This moment mattered not just for Derek, but for the person I was becoming. The easy path would be to lecture him, to enumerate his sins, and make him grovel for forgiveness he might not deserve. The satisfying path would be to tell him exactly how much pain he had caused me over the years, to finally release the anger I had been carrying since childhood. But neither of those paths led anywhere I wanted to go. "Because you're not your parents' lies," I said finally. "You didn't choose to be born into this situation. You didn't choose to have a mother who was trapped and a father who used you as leverage. You didn't choose to be raised believing you were better than me, that you deserved more than me, that I was somehow less worthy of love and respect." Derek's face contorted with something that might have been shame or grief or both. "I know you made choices," I continued. "The videos, the attacks, the way you laughed when Dad threw me out. Those were your choices, and you'll have to live with them. But the foundation of your identity, the lie you were built on, that wasn't your fault. And I won't punish you for something you didn't create. So you forgive me?" The hope in his voice was painful to hear. "No." I saw him flinch at the word. "I don't forgive you. Not yet, maybe not ever. What you did hurt me deeply, and forgiveness isn't something I can manufacture just because you're having a hard time. But I'm also not going to carry hatred for you. Hatred would only poison my own life, and I've spent too many years being poisoned by this family already." I leaned forward, making sure he understood the weight of what I was about to say. "You have work to do, Derek. Real work. Not the kind where you post apology videos and wait for people to tell you you're brave. The kind where you look honestly at who you've been, acknowledge the harm you've caused, and start building a different kind of person. You have to earn your way back, not to me, but to yourself. Because right now, stripped of all the lies and the privilege and the false identity, you don't actually know who you are. That's terrifying, but it's also an opportunity. You get to choose now. You get to decide what kind of man you want to become." He sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing my words. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. I don't know how to do that. I don't know where to start. That's okay. No one does at first. I thought about my own journey, about the woman I had been just months ago compared to the woman I was becoming. I can help you find resources. Therapy support groups, maybe some volunteer work to get you out of your own head. But I can't do the work for you. And I can't pretend everything is fine when it isn't. We're not going to have some magical reconciliation where we hug and cry and suddenly become the siblings we never were. That's not realistic. Derek nodded slowly, accepting conditions that the old version of him would have rejected outright. Something had fundamentally shifted in him, broken open by the revelation of his true origins. Whether that breaking would lead to growth or destruction remained to be seen. He stood to leave, then paused at the doorway of the living room. "There's one more thing," he said. "Dad wants to see you. He asked me to tell you. He says it's the last time he'll ask." I turned to look out the window at the garden Grandfather and I had planted together so many years ago. The tomato plants were long gone, replaced by ornamental shrubs that Victoria had chosen. But I could still see the outline of where our little vegetable patch had been. Still remember the feeling of dirt under my fingernails and Grandfather's patient voice guiding my hands. "What are you going to do?" Derek asked. I watched the autumn light filter through the clouds, casting long shadows across the yard. My father wanted to see me one last time. The man who had thrown me out, who had tried to steal my inheritance, who had orchestrated a campaign to destroy my reputation. He was waiting for an answer. "I'll see him," I said finally, "but on my terms, and only once." I chose a cafe downtown, a busy place with large windows and plenty of other customers. I would not meet my father in private, would not give him the opportunity to manipulate or threaten or plead without witnesses. Louise insisted on driving me and waiting in a car across the street, close enough to intervene if anything went wrong. I did not think it would come to that, but I appreciated her presence nonetheless. After everything we had been through, her loyalty had become one of the unexpected gifts of this entire ordeal. My father was already seated when I arrived, tucked into a corner booth with a cup of coffee. He did not seem to be drinking. The transformation in his appearance shocked me, even though I had been warned to expect it. The man I saw bore almost no resemblance to the powerful patriarch who had dominated my childhood. His hair, always meticulously groomed, was now thin and unkempt. His face was gaunt, the skin hanging loosely, as if he had lost significant weight in a short time. His expensive suit had been replaced by a plain button-down shirt that looked like it had been worn multiple times without washing. But it was his eyes that struck me most. The cold confidence that had always defined his gaze was gone, replaced by something hollow and exhausted. He looked like a man who had been running from something for a very long time and had finally been caught. I slid into the seat across from him, keeping the table between us like a barrier. "You wanted to see me." He nodded slowly, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I almost didn't. We sat in silence for a moment, the ambient noise of the cafe filling the space between us. Other customers laughed and chatted, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening in the corner booth. I waited for him to speak, refusing to make this easy for him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he finally said. "About my life, about the choices I made, about you." He looked up at me, and I saw tears forming in his eyes, something I had never witnessed in all my years as his daughter. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to listen. But I need to say some things, and I need you to hear them. After that, if you want to walk away and never see me again, I'll understand." I said nothing, giving him neither permission nor rejection. He took my silence as an invitation to continue. "I was jealous of you," he said. "From the time you were a little girl, I was jealous of my own daughter. You reminded me so much of my father, the way you thought about things, the way you questioned everything, the way you seemed to understand things that took me years to figure out. Every time I looked at you, I saw him. And every time I saw him in you, I was reminded of everything I wasn't. His voice cracked, but he pushed forward. My father was brilliant, principled, strong in ways I could never be. I spent my whole life trying to earn his respect, trying to prove that I was worthy of being his son. But no matter what I did, no matter how successful I became, I always felt like I was failing some test I didn't understand. And then you came along and you were everything he valued, everything I wasn't. He wiped his eyes with a napkin, his hands trembling. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know that sounds like an excuse, but it's the truth. I was trying to prove that you weren't better than me. I was trying to tear you down so I didn't have to face my own inadequacy. Every cruel word, every dismissal, every time I made you feel worthless, it was because I couldn't stand seeing my father's qualities in someone else when I could never find them in myself. I listened without interrupting, watching his face, as he stripped away decades of pretense and exposed the wounded child underneath. This was not the father I had known. This was someone I had never met, someone who had been hiding behind arrogance and cruelty for so long that even he had forgotten who he really was. You were always better than me, Marissa. From the beginning. Not because you were smarter or more successful, but because you had something I lost a long time ago. Integrity. The ability to be honest with yourself. The courage to do what's right even when it costs you everything. He met my eyes, and I saw decades of regret compressed into a single moment. My father knew it. That's why he left everything to you. And deep down, I knew it too. That's why I hated you for it. The cafe continued its cheerful bustle around us. Customers coming and going, baristas calling out orders, life proceeding as if nothing extraordinary was happening. But in that corner booth, something was shifting, some ancient structure crumbling under the weight of truth finally spoken. I don't expect anything from you, he said. I just needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud to admit what I was and why I did what I did. Whatever happens next is up to you. I sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had said. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, that we could start over and build the relationship we never had. But that part was small and easily overruled by years of accumulated pain. I hear you, I said finally, and I believe you mean what you're saying right now. But words don't erase scars. They don't undo decades of cruelty. They don't repair the damage you did to my sense of self, my ability to trust my belief that I deserved to be loved. He nodded, accepting this without argument. I hope you find peace with yourself, I continued. I hope you can build something meaningful with whatever time you have left, but that's your journey, not mine. I don't carry your burden anymore. I'm not responsible for your redemption, and I won't sacrifice my own healing to make you feel better about your choices. I stood up, gathering my coat and purse. He remained seated, looking up at me with an expression I could not quite read. Marissa, he said as I turned to leave. One last question. Do you think your grandfather would be proud of you, of who you've become? I paused at the edge of the booth, my hand resting on the back of the chair. The question hung in the air between us, heavier than anything else that had been said. I thought about grandfather's letters, his recordings, his unwavering faith in my potential. I thought about the photo albums hidden in his study, the journal documenting his hopes for my future. I did not turn around. I did not give my father the satisfaction of seeing my face. Yes, I said quietly, I think he would be. Then I walked out into the autumn afternoon, leaving my father alone with his coffee and his regrets. The renovation took 3 months. Workers transformed the house that had been a place of pain into something entirely new, tearing down walls that had felt like prison barriers, opening up spaces that had once been suffocating, letting light flood into rooms that had always seemed dark, no matter how many lamps were turned on. I supervised every change, making decisions about colors and layouts and furniture with a clarity of purpose I had never felt before. This was not just construction. It was alchemy, the transmutation of trauma into hope. The Kelly Promise Foundation officially opened its doors on a crisp Saturday morning in early spring. The name honored both my grandparents Eleanor and William Kelly, whose legacy of fighting for justice would now continue through the women we served. The mission was simple but desperately needed, providing housing assistance, legal support, and counseling for women over 50 who had been abandoned or financially abused by their families. Women like me who had been thrown away by the people who were supposed to love them. Women like Louise's daughter Christine, who had been trapped by predatory landlords. Women whose stories had been silenced for too long. Louise stood beside me as the first guests arrived, her transformation from reluctant informant to trusted ally, now complete. When I had offered her the position of operations director, she had wept and asked why I would trust her with something so important after what she had done. I told her the truth because she understood what desperation felt like, because she knew the lengths people would go to protect their families, because her redemption story was exactly the kind of journey our foundation would help other women take. She had thrown herself into the role with a dedication that bordered on obsession, determined to prove worthy of the second chance she had been given. Patricia, the nurse who had cared for grandfather in his final days, arrived early to help set up the refreshment table. She had been volunteering with us throughout the renovation, spending her weekends painting walls and organizing supply closets, and offering quiet wisdom to anyone who needed it. When I asked why she kept coming back, she said that caring for my grandfather had been one of the most meaningful experiences of her life, and this felt like a way of honoring his memory. The opening ceremony drew more attention than I had anticipated. Local news crews set up cameras on the lawn. Journalists who had covered the Kelly family saga were eager to report on this new chapter. But more meaningful than the media presence was the crowd of ordinary women who came simply because they had heard about our mission and wanted to support it or be supported by it. They lined up to share their stories with whoever would listen. A 72-year-old woman whose children had written her out of their lives after she remarried following her husband's death. A 65-year-old whose son had convinced her to sign over her house, then evicted her when he needed money for his business. A 58-year-old whose siblings had manipulated their dying mother into changing her will, leaving her with nothing after decades of being the primary caregiver. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its essence. Families could be the source of our deepest wounds, and healing required more than just time. It required community resources and the knowledge that you were not alone. I moved through the crowd listening, embracing, promising that the Kelly Promise Foundation would be there for them. Each interaction reinforced my sense of purpose. I was not just honoring grandfather. I was creating the family. I had never had a community of women who understood each other's pain and were committed to helping each other heal. Unexpected faces appeared throughout the afternoon. Victoria arrived quietly, dressed simply, without the designer clothes and perfect makeup that had always been her armor. She did not approach me directly, but instead spent time talking with some of the older women, sharing her own story of being trapped in a controlling marriage for 30 years. When our eyes met across the room, she gave me a small nod of acknowledgement. She was not here as family. She was here as someone seeking a new beginning, and that was enough. A delivery person brought an enormous arrangement of flowers to the front desk. The card attached read simply, "I'm not ready to be there yet, but I'm proud of what you're doing, Derek." I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through my chest. My brother was trying in his own limited way to build a bridge. Whether that bridge would ever be strong enough to cross remained to be seen, but the gesture mattered. It was late in the afternoon when I noticed a figure standing at the very edge of the property, partially hidden by the old oak tree near the street. I knew immediately who it was. My father had come not to participate, not to intrude, but simply to watch. He looked even older than he had at the cafe, diminished by everything he had lost. A shadow of the powerful man who had once dominated my childhood. Our eyes met across the distance. Neither of us moved or waved or made any gesture of acknowledgement. We simply looked at each other for a long moment, Two people connected by blood and history and pain, now separated by choices that could never be undone. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner without looking back. I did not know if I would ever see him again. I was surprised to find that the uncertainty did not hurt as much as I expected it to. The ceremony was winding down when a woman I did not recognize approached me. She was in her late 70s, with silver hair and weathered hands that clutched a worn photograph against her chest. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she looked at me with an intensity that made me pause. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you Eleanor Kelly's granddaughter? I saw the foundation's name and I had to come. I knew your grandmother a long time ago. We were neighbors before she got sick." I nodded, intrigued by this unexpected connection to my grandmother, a woman I had never known. The elderly woman held out the photograph with shaking hands. It showed two young women standing arm in arm, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them was clearly my grandmother, her features unmistakable even in the faded image. "There's something I've wanted to tell someone in your family for 30 years, the woman said. "Something about Eleanor, about the lawsuit, about what really happened. I think you deserve to know the truth." I guided the elderly woman to a quiet corner of the garden away from the lingering guests and the bustle of the closing ceremony. Her name was Dorothy, and she had lived next door to my grandparents for nearly 15 years before the illness came. As she spoke, her memories painted a portrait of my grandmother that I had never known a woman of fierce compassion and quiet strength who believed that every person had value regardless of their circumstances. "Eleanor used to say that what we leave behind isn't money or property or things," Dorothy told me, her eyes distant with recollection. "She said what matters is the people we lift up along the way, the lives we touch, the kindness we plant that grows long after we're gone." She pressed the photograph into my hands. "When I heard about your foundation, about what you're doing here, I knew she would be so proud. You're continuing exactly what she believed in." The words settled into my heart like seeds finding fertile soil. I had spent so much time focused on grandfather's legacy, on his fortune, and his letters and his careful planning, that I had almost forgotten the woman whose death had started everything. Grandmother Eleanor, whose illness had driven grandfather to fight for justice, whose memory had fueled a decade-long legal battle, whose love had shaped the man who had shaped me. This foundation was not just my legacy or grandfather's legacy. It was hers too. A circle completing itself across 3 generations. After Dorothy left, after the last guests had departed and the staff had finished cleaning up, I found myself alone in grandfather's study. My office now. The room where he had spent so many hours planning for a future he would never see, believing in a granddaughter who had not yet learned to believe in herself. His leather chair still sat behind the desk, and I settled into it feeling the worn cushions conform to my body the way they had conformed to his for so many years. I took out his letter, the one I had read so many times that the creases were beginning to wear thin, and I read it one final time. His words about integrity and courage, about the value of tears, about his faith, that I would prove everyone wrong. When I finished, I did not fold it and put it away. Instead, I found a frame in the closet, one that had held some forgettable corporate award of my father's, and I placed grandfather's letter inside. I hung it on the wall directly across from the desk where I would see it every day when I looked up from my work. Then I sat down and wrote a letter of my own, not to anyone else but to myself, to be sealed and stored and opened in 10 years. "Dear Marissa," I wrote, "you transformed your deepest wound into your greatest strength. You chose justice over hatred, truth over revenge. You built something that will help women for years to come. Grandfather was right to believe in you, and now finally you believe in yourself." I sealed the envelope and placed it in the locked cabinet where grandfather's photo albums still lived. A promise to my future self that the journey I had begun would continue. The sun was setting by the time I finished painting the sky outside my window in shades of gold and amber and rose. I stood and watched the light change, thinking about everything that had brought me to this moment. The dinner party where I had been thrown out, the card in my wallet, the banker's alarm, The letters and recordings and revelations. The betrayals and confessions and small acts of mercy. All of it had led here to this room, to this purpose, to this version of myself that I was still learning to recognize. My phone rang, breaking the contemplative silence. I looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number, probably another woman who had heard about the foundation and needed help. I smiled, picked up the phone and said, "Hello, this is Marissa. I'm listening." Through the window, the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon. Somewhere out there, women were struggling with the same pain I had known, the same rejection, the same desperate need to be seen and valued and believed. I could not save all of them, but I could listen. I could help. I could show them that their stories mattered and their lives had worth. Grandfather had always known what I could become. Now I knew it too. Sometimes the family you lose is the one that sets you free. Thank you for staying with Marissa until the very end of her journey. Her story reminds us that our worth is never determined by those who fail to see it, and that the deepest wounds can become the foundation for our greatest purpose. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Have you ever discovered strength you never knew you had? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you stories of resilience, justice, and the triumph of the human spirit. Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember, sometimes the family you lose is the one that sets you free.